So hey guys, how are you all? Welcome to So we are back with a brand new movie Onward if Naruto went with Rhaenys in the bathroom, but before we start, be sure to subscribe to our channel and like this video. Now let's begin the story. When he awoke he did so with a gasp, immediately jerking into a seated position while his hands instinctively went to patting at his chest only to find not so much as a bruise upon it. His breathing, which had started heavy, soon slowed to normal as he calmed himself and took stock of his surroundings to find that he was lying on a grassy plain in the shade of a tree. Finally awake then, called a voice behind him, one he'd never heard before. Turning to it he found himself eyeing a man who stood at the base of the tree. He was an older man, perhaps in his 40s if he had to guess an age. He was tall, impressively so, and stocky as well. Though he'd never met the man before, he had an idea who he was simply due to his long brown hair, long face and the gray eyes of the Starks. Lord Stark. He greeted the man with a short bow of the head as he stood to his feet. Prince Rhaegar. You're both awake, good. The voice that spoke was new to both, and turning towards it they found a figure emerging from the bushes to the left. Both men could only look on in a stunned surprise as despite the deep, powerful voice it was not a man that emerged but a beast. Specifically speaking, it was a fox, only a kind that neither had ever seen before. To start, it was massive as it stood at a height above the two men, and to stand taller than Lord Stark was no small feat. Its fur was a golden color bright enough to match the sun, while its eyes were blue enough to match the sky, and 9 tails waved lazily behind it. Suddenly, as if its very appearance was not enough, the creature shifted with fur, tails, claws and fangs fading away until the creature was gone and in its place was a man. He had blonde hair that would put the Lannisters to shame, as instead of pale blonde it was golden blonde, as if blessed by the sun itself. He still retained the sky-blue eyes of his fox form as well, only the pupils were now round like a human's, and he had odd markings on his face, 3 lines on each cheek giving the appearance of whiskers. As his form settled he stretched himself with the sound of bones cracking echoing through the clearing for a few moments before he settled. "Sorry about that, I've been asleep for a while," stated the being calmly as he approached them. "Who are you, stranger?" questioned Lord Stark just before the prince himself could do so. "Now that is the question. I have many names, but the two of you may call me Naruto." It was a name the likes of which neither man had ever heard before, but knew they'd not be forgetting any time soon. "As for your next question of our current location, we call it the Borderlands. It is one of many spiritual nexus points that separates the realm of the living from that of the dead," explained Naruto. "So we are dead," said Rhaegar, frowning. "Indeed, both of you for many years now. As to why I have summoned your spirits here, it is due to your descendants, specifically your son, and your grandchildren. Come." The two surprised men could do little more than follow after the being as he led them through the forest to the edge of a lake. Within the body of water there were a number of stones that led to what the Stark Lord recognized as a weirwood tree, the size of which he'd never seen or thought possible, as it was taller than the towers of even the tallest castles. "You're one of the old gods," exclaimed Lord Stark softly. "Indeed, that is what your people and the children now call us. I am also one of the Valyrian gods. Of course both the first men and Valyrians seem to have forgotten much about us," revealed Naruto, shocking both men. "For instance, you call this a weirwood tree. Like me, this tree has many names. Your ancestors called it Yggdrasil, the world tree. The ones you are familiar with are grown from the seeds of this one." Turning away from the tree, Naruto motioned to the water. The water itself was clear and deep enough where neither man could see the bottom. "Step into the water and submerge yourselves. As spirits you do not require to breathe. You will witness what has befallen your families, and when it is done, and you emerge, we will speak on how we will fix it." With his piece said, Naruto sat himself down with his legs crossed and closed his eyes. With no choice other than to do as bid, the two men waded out into the water. When they emerged they had no idea of just how much time had passed, as it could have been mere minutes or many years or anything in between the 2 points. While they had no clue how much time had passed, it was obvious some had, as several more figures had gathered on the shore. Though they had not met some of them, each man recognized them all the same for the most part. Eddard Stark, Robb Stark, Bran Stark, Rickon Stark, Brandon Stark, Lyanna Stark, Arya Stark, Sansa Stark, Elia Martell, Rhaella Targaryen, Daenerys Targaryen, Aegon, Jon Targaryen, and many more. The sight of the gathered individuals had both men moving towards them, yet before they could speak their host opened his eyes and stood. "Now that everyone has been gathered and caught up, let us make sure everyone is on the same page," stated Naruto, getting the group's attention. "Aegon, now that you have seen things from another perspective, can you tell me what was happening with Brandon the Younger?" questioned Naruto. The person addressed was a black-haired young man who just by his looks alone would have never been thought of as anything but a Stark. Upon hearing the name he winced visibly yet answered regardless. "That old man, he took over his body didn't he?" questioned the former bastard of Winterfell, words that caused many to freeze in place. Indeed. Brynden Rivers, or as he is more commonly known, Bloodraven, has spent decades planning his vengeance and ensured his success upon taking young Brandon's body as his own, stated Naruto. Brandon Stark himself looked quite young, perhaps only 13 or 14 years old. His auburn hair was long almost midway down his back, and he sat surrounded by his siblings and Aegon, whom converged upon him. "Lady Liara," called Naruto, causing many heads, especially the Starks, to snap up and take in the woman whom he addressed. She was quite young, appearing as if she were in her early 20s, and had the Stark looks about her with long brown hair and gray eyes. She was a beauty and stood with a poise befitting of a noble. "What mistake did your husband make?" "There were plenty, but the root was falling for the poison words of that southern maester," said the woman. Her words were accompanied by a glare at her husband that had Lord Rickard Stark cringing back, much to the surprise of many and the elation of Arya, who simply smirked. "Queen Rhaella, what mistake did Princess Lyanna make?" questioned Naruto. "She was too trusting of Lisa Tully. She should have ensured multiple means of her message getting out." The next stretch of time was spent going over the mistakes that had been made. None but Rickon was spared of this, and there were quite a few tongue lashings that were handed out in this time as well. Eventually Naruto had enough, as he could see all of them had gotten the message that none of them had acted without mistakes. "As much as this was needed, you were not all gathered here simply to point out your mistakes. I will be sending you back, all of you, though obviously at different times. That said, let us discuss how we fix this mess," said Naruto. After what seemed like several hours of planning, during which time his wife had raked him over the coals for sending Eddard to the Vale for so long, Lord Stark finally felt enough had been covered. "Anything else?" questioned Lord Rickard. "The fishwife will need to come to Winterfell early," said Lyanna. It wasn't the first time Catelyn Tully had been brought up between the group. Of course, when mentioned, many of them refused to call her by name. Thankfully, at least the woman wasn't actually there, as many in attendance wanted nothing more than to beat her bloody. Eddard and Sansa had gotten it bad enough, but there was a special hatred for Catelyn Tully amongst the Starks and Targaryens for how she had treated Jon, amongst other things. While they could have picked another bride for his son, Liara would not have it. In her words, she would put up with the idiot southerner if only for her grandchildren. That said, she'd then given Eddard the tongue lashing of the ages over the desecration of their lands and his caving to her desires. Sansa herself was silent, though learning that she had nearly been excluded from this gathering and had only been included because Naruto felt that the girl could be useful in the long run provided she spend some time under her grandmother Liara, which was why she currently sat silently beside the woman. While he felt for the girl, Rickard honestly thought she deserved her treatment. Yes, she'd gotten the North its independence, but she'd done so by betraying her family and even broken an oath made before Weirwood. This of course explained how she died, as when that news got out she'd been killed for it. They'd used poison, so at least she'd had a clean death. The Karstarks had taken control of the North, though, as a regent until Arya returned from her travels. Arya unfortunately hadn't lasted much longer. Her ship had been caught within a fierce storm and ended up sinking after crashing into a boulder that stuck out of the water. She ended up drowning at sea. As for Jon, he ended up hanging himself from the branch of a weirwood beyond the wall only a few months after being banished. Thus had ended both houses, Targaryen and Stark. According to Naruto, many of the gods had been very displeased by this turn of events, as it was not supposed to happen, and Naruto, who was the strongest amongst them, had been voted to come and fix it. After that point the blonde had been silent for the most part, sitting cross-legged and smoking a pipe. Aside from chuckling when his Targaryen grandson insisted on a name that was not Aegon, Naruto had maintained that silence, allowing them to make up their own plans. "Now that you have finalized your plans, I'll say they're decent but short-sighted," said Naruto, much to the surprise of the group. "Rickard Stark, you will have your people do an exploration of the North. You will find that it is filled with a wealth of goods. You will also begin negotiations between the leaders of the North and the leaders of those beyond the Wall, or the Free Folk, as they like to be called. You have forgotten the old ways of your people. They will teach you much that you have lost and allow you an exploration of those lands for goods. In turn, you will make White Harbor into a trade outpost. Also send your people out to explore the world. It is much bigger than you know. This will increase the influence, reputation and wealth of the North, and slowly your people will come out of the isolationist mindset," said Naruto, getting a nod from the man. "Rhaella Targaryen, you must increase your own personal influence on the world. I have been informed you had plans once that you never made known. Implement them. This will make things easier on your daughter when her time comes. While Tywin is distracted, you will see to your husband's return from Duskensdale. You will learn who to send when the time grows near. This will increase your standing with him, allowing you to stretch your wings even more and give you some influence over him. You will in effect become the power behind the throne," said Naruto, making her eyes go wide before she nodded. "Doran, Oberyn and Elia Martell, you will spend your youth as you had for the most part, except for one caveat. You will investigate your land's history and explore its regions. In time you will find secrets that you have lost, including the rediscovery of your magic. With that find you will be able to heal Elia of her illness and Doran of his when it comes. Doran, you will also have to let others in on your plans in the future. It will help temper the rashness of your brother and others around you. Elia, your second pregnancy will come later than before. I will not take a child from you, so he shall instead be born later," said Naruto, shocking them. "Rhaegar Targaryen, you will investigate your own house's history, and in doing so, like the Starks and Martells, you will regain what your house has lost. Aegon, you do not have to pick one over the other. You are a Targaryen and a Stark, a dragon and a wolf. Both the land and skies are your domain. Like you, I was also orphaned the day I was born and spent my early life chasing identity, purpose and craving the acknowledgement of others. Embrace who you are. Stop fighting your instincts and emulating Eddard. Your uncle, while for the most part is a good man, is also a fool. It got him killed and destroyed his family. Your emulation got you killed and made you easily manipulated. Embrace this second chance, young man," said Naruto, locking eyes with Jon, who could only shakily nod his head. "Arya Stark, you will lose the gifts of the Faceless. In exchange you will learn other skills that will make you even deadlier, but without stripping away your identity. Mind your teachers well, and perhaps one day I shall teach you a bit myself," said the blonde, getting a serious nod from her. "As for you, Sansa Stark, embrace this second chance, for you will not get another. Know that there are worse fates than death should you fail me," said Naruto, his eyes flashing a baleful red for but a moment before returning to their original blue, getting a shivering Sansa to nod shakily. With his piece said, Naruto snapped his fingers, causing the weirwood to glow with a white light before what looked like a doorway appeared within its trunk, from which nothing could be seen but the white light shining from it. "The tree shall guide you back to the world of the living. In time you will all receive visits from friends of mine who will aid you along the way," said the blonde. Leading the troop from the front, Prince Rhaegar took a deep breath before letting it out and crossing the pond to the island of the tree and walking into the light. As the last of them left Naruto's side before he shifted back to his fox form and drifted to sleep. Rickard Stark was enjoying this second chance at life. He'd woken with a feeling of strength and exuberance he'd not felt in years beside his beloved Liara, and had simply watched her in her sleep. She was beautiful, a true winter rose if ever there was someone who could be equal to such beauty. It had been while he'd been taking in her features that he'd noticed the swell in her belly, and he'd known that she was well into her pregnancy with Benjen. With that being the case, that would make Lyanna nearly a year old, Eddard 4 and Brandon 5, all of them still young and innocent of the ways of the world and the evil that inhabited it. One of his biggest regrets was that he had not enjoyed his time with them when they were at this age, too busy with his southern ambitions, that had only gotten worse after Liara passed and they began to age. He had missed most of their growth, leaving them in the care of Nan while he went about his work, so much so that their personalities had missed him. That would be a mistake that would not be repeated. He swore to himself and the old gods he would do better, be better. When she finally awoke, he had taken the time to simply hold her in his arms, allowing himself the vulnerability he'd never done previously. Then they'd talked, not of the North or the South or anything so foolish. Instead they'd spoken of their family. Aside from themselves, their children and her sister, they were the last bit of blood of House Stark, though now that they had the benefit of the knowledge they'd gained, they knew this was no accident. That said, working together the two of them would ensure that their house would flourish in the times ahead. That, however, had been a few weeks ago, time in which Winterfell began preparations for the arrival of the Northern Lords. He'd summoned all of them to Winterfell for a council, something that had not been called for outside of war times in many years, but would have to be done if both their own plans and the directives he'd been given were to proceed. Furthermore, he directed them to bring their wives, and if they had an heir that was of age and could be of aid, then they were also directed to bring them as well. Maester Whaleys had of course tried to discover information recording the meeting, but he'd frozen him out. The Hightower bastard would play no part in this meeting. He himself had spent much of his time sequestered within the Lords section of Winterfell's library, a place that many did not even know existed, and a place he'd not entered since his father was buried. He'd known even before their return to the living world that he'd need to pay the place a visit, and in his studies he'd discovered many secrets that previous lords and even kings of winter had hidden therein. He shared what he found only with Liara, and they'd adapted or come up with new plans to implement some of what had been found. Some of what they had found they'd been unable to use but knew would come in handy in the future. Such thoughts, however, were interrupted by a knock on the door of his solar. "Come," called Rickard. The person to enter was a young boy, only 9, named Evan of House Castle. He was not surprised to see him. Evan was a runner, one of many children who were sent to deliver messages when not in his lessons, which helped to earn coin for his family. "Apologies, my lord, there are a pair of travelers at the gate. They say they were sent by someone called Thor. Allow them entry and have them escorted here. Also have someone send my wife to meet us as well. She is currently with my children in the library," said Rickard. "At once, my lord," said Evan before stepping back and closing the door. It didn't take too long for Liara to arrive carrying Lyanna in her arms. Within 20 minutes of her arrival there was another knock on the door before it was opened to admit a pair of people, one male and one female. The man was quite tall, perhaps an equal to himself in height, and well-built, fair skin. He had waist-length, spiky white hair, similar to a Targaryen tied back into a ponytail, with 2 shoulder-length bangs framing his face, and there were red lines under his eyes which extended down to the bottom of his face. The woman was much shorter, even a few inches shorter than Liara, and had brown eyes with straight blonde hair that parts above her forehead, allowing a purple diamond-sharp marking to be seen in the center of her forehead. Her hair has shoulder-length bangs that frame her face, and the rest reaches her lower back. Though blonde, she looked nothing like a Lannister, and next to her they would actually appear quite plain, as this woman was honestly amongst the most beautiful he'd ever seen. The two were introduced as Jiraiya and Tsunade, strange names in his opinion, but ones he committed to memory all the same. "When Lord Naruto said he was sending aid, I didn't think it would be this soon," said Liara almost as soon as the door was closed. "Yeah, well, the brat was never one to waste time on something he thought important," said Jiraiya. "What plans do you have at the moment?" questioned Tsunade. For the next while they spoke on their plans, with Jiraiya and Tsunade adding their own input. Jiraiya, as it turns out, was an experienced spymaster and had been sent to help them build their own network, something neither of them had taken into consideration before. Tsunade, however, was a healer and one who went about it by way of magic. From what he understood, her primary function there was to ensure Liara survived the birthing bed. The two of them, however, were also experienced combatants and would be helping with the training of their people. In doing this, they'd imparted on them the knowledge on tools and tricks their people had used that had been discarded over time, amongst other things. Over the next few weeks he'd watched as the two of them helped in the training of a small select group of individuals. They taught not just armed combat but unarmed as well, making those they trained look like green boys in the process quite easily as well. Northerners were a hard people, but watching the two of them break those men made Rickard question how much they had lost in the time since the Andals had first invaded or the Targaryen conquest. They liked to say, "The North remembers," but Jiraiya liked to remind him they'd forgotten much as well. Brandon and Eddard had begun their training under the two of them as well, and as they were so small it was simply the basics for hand-to-hand lessons, stances and the like for the most part. The boys had been happy to start in their lessons in this regard, and Jiraiya had them thinking of it more as a game than anything at this point. He was thankful for this at the moment, as it gave him one less worry at the moment. Liara had gone into labor shortly after they'd broken their fast this morning and had been taken back to their chambers by Tsunade for the birthing. Prior to this, Liara had been examined quite a few times by Tsunade, the first time in which she'd had to remove poison from her system, something she'd had to do every few weeks since then. He was thankful for Tsunade, especially now, as he had no doubt that left in the care of Whaley's his dear Liara would die. As it was, he was still worried but not deathly afraid, as he'd been the last time when she died in the process. To distract not just himself but his children, they were all currently in his solar as the boys went about their lessons. In this instance they were learning to read and write in the old way. Brandon, for instance, had taken to the old tongue quite easily but struggled in his study of runes. Eddard conversely took easier to runes but struggled with the old tongue, though he had no doubt that in time both would become quite fluent in both. He was also studying in this way, though he was further along in the study as he could keep later hours than the boys. At the moment he was not working but instead had his time occupied by Lyanna, who he was taking care to feed. A short string of knocks at his door was soon distracting him and had him calling for them to enter. "Sorry to disturb, my lord," came a familiar young voice. Looking over, he was greeted to the sight of another young boy, this one by the name of Justin Poole, the second son of Erin Poole, the captain of the Wintertown Guard. "Riders have arrived in Wintertown. Lords Manderley, Karstark and Umber are all a day's ride away," said the young boy. "All right. Find Lady Frida and ask her to have rooms prepared for them," said Rickard, getting an affirmative from the boy before he left the room. The door however did not close and instead was pushed open as another figure entered. This one was a young lady, on the cusps of adulthood that he knew as Brianna, who'd been acting as Tsunade's helper over the last few weeks. "It's over. Lady Tsunade says both are fine and you should come meet your son," said Brianna with a bright smile, one he couldn't help but return as he stood to his feet with Lyanna. "All right boys, let's go see your mother." As the Northern Lords arrived over the next few days, it was to find the residents of both Wintertown and Winterfell in a celebratory mood due to the birth of Lord Stark's newest son Benjen. Food was brought down from Winterfell from the Lord's feast for the town's residents, allowing them to eat a quality of food they wouldn't normally receive based on their own efforts. The Lords had traveled light on men with anywhere from 30 to 50 in their party. While the nobles and minor lords were afforded rooms within Winterfell itself, the regular guards were being roomed in Wintertown, which allowed them to join in on the celebratory atmosphere. At the moment, the Great Hall in Winterfell was full of lords and ladies as they met with their warden. They were a boisterous lot as they ate and made merry. However, that came to a halt and a serious mood settled on the room as the meal ended and the remains were collected. They were surprised as servants brought in parchment, quills and inkwells, allowing them to take notes of the meeting. For the most part the women took hold of these instruments, though there were a few of the men who felt confident enough of their writing ability to do so themselves. "It's been nearly 12,000 years since our ancestors came to this land. In the 300 years since the conquest we have been reduced in stature by the Southerners. They believe us savages believe themselves better than us, yet every time something goes wrong we have to travel south to take care of it. I have grown sick of this insult, and those of you who fought with us in the last war may well be just as sick. To that end my wife and I have decided we will change this narrative," stated Rickard, his words enough to catch the attention of every person in the room. "To do this certain steps must be taken, steps all of us may be uncomfortable with," stated Liara, surprising many that she was even present, let alone speaking in this meeting. "Each of us will do an exploration of our lands for trade, able goods or even metals and gemstones. We are not a material people, I know, but it is a necessary evil for our children's future," said Liara. "White Harbor will become a trading hub and not just an outpost. This means we will send people out from the harbor to engage in trade in other lands," said Rickard. "Do we have ships capable of such a thing?" questioned Roderick Risewell. "We will. I have found Brandon the shipwright's plans. It has been some time since they were designed, however, and I'm sure they can be improved upon. With that in mind, aside from merchant ships, we will also be rebuilding our naval fleet. We will have shipyards built for White Harbor, Sea Dragon Point, Flint's Finger and Bear Island," said Lord Rickard. "That will definitely help defend us from any more Ironborn raids," said Jeor Mormont. "We will also build our own bank. The king won't raise our taxes and we'll not be sending our coin outside of our reach. We will need people very good with numbers to run it, and the rules regarding it and our spending will be very strict. We will not be doing this just to end up like those weak Southerners, especially the Reachmen," said Liara, much to the agreement of the group. "We will also be training every man, woman and child for combat. For too long we've acted like Southerners and followed their customs. We are Northmen, it is long past time we revived our own," said Rickard. "Are you sure you want to send women into battle?" questioned Lord Manderley. "You have Southern roots, so I'll let that one slide. Our shield maidens were active in battle until the conquest. We follow the old gods as such. Those who die nobly in battle are the most honored and get to see paradise, while those who die of old age or sickness will not," said Liara. "We don't raise weak women in the north, nor do we celebrate them," said Lady Rhaenys Glover, something that got support from all the women who were truly of the north. "Next we will be reviving the Fangs of Fenrir," said Lord Stark, causing a dead silence to come over the room. Rhaella Targaryen was enjoying her second chance at life, much more than she had her first. She'd awoken nearly 3 years ago now, in the aftermath of what had been her second miscarriage. The version of her that had emerged from her rooms at that point had been much different from what many had expected, for instead of a broken woman she'd emerged as a dragon. Aerys, as both her brother and husband, had noticed the change immediately and had actually been pleased to see it. That had surprised her, until she realized this version of her brother had only been king for 2 years at that point and as such had not yet been twisted by the manipulators surrounding him, much less the horrors of Duskensdale. Rhaegar had been barely 5 at the time, and she'd quite easily been able to take charge of his scholarly education and pointed him in the direction she knew he needed to be in. In the years since then she had emerged as a true player in the great game instead of just another pawn as she'd been in her last life. On top of her normal duties, she had not only taken on the responsibility of educating Rhaegar, but at this point had also taken on the duties of Master of Coin and handled their foreign affairs, and as such she was an incredibly busy woman. This had the benefit of removing even the slightest thought of her being unfaithful in her marriage, as everyone including her husband knew she had purposely buried herself in work. This work had not ceased even now that she was clearly pregnant yet again, something that seemed to be a surprise to the court at large. That, however, wasn't the only thing her influence had changed, as it had even affected the small council itself. In her first go-through of life, the Master of Laws had been Lord Simon Staunton and the Master of Coin Lord Quarlton Chelsted. This time the Master of Law was Sir Aaron Royce, the younger brother of Lord Yon Royce of the Vale, while she was performing the duties of Master of Coin, in effect removing two of the biggest contributors of turning Aerys against Rhaegar. At the moment she was located like many in the throne room, though she stood on an upper level with Rhaegar looking down on the scene, unlike everyone else who stood on the ground floor. They were whispers that something major had happened in the north, but for the most part the place was quiet. Their Master of Whispers had also been unable to get further details, something that unnerved everyone, and she noticed Tywin had been especially displeased, which caused her no end of amusement. They had however sent a raven stating someone would be coming to speak with the king, and they had seen ships flying northern banners coming into the harbor earlier in the day. The room was already packed, both with the regular day-to-day of court life and those coming just to see the northern visitors. For the most part she ignored the goings-on of the court, instead her focus on teaching Rhaegar how to read the room and how to look past words to see their intentions. Rhaegar was of course a quick study and always had been, only now she was seeing it for herself firsthand instead of hearing reports about it. As a plus, she'd gotten him out from the influence of septas and maesters, instead teaching him to embrace his inner dragon early instead of suppressing it. It was only upon the arrival of the northerners to the room that the normal proceedings stopped. "Tell me, Rhaegar, which houses are part of the northern contingent?" questioned Rhaella. Rhaegar himself was still a young boy, only just seeing his 8th name day pass, and as this was a question typical for his age. "I see the Merman of House Manderley and the Sunburst of House Karstark," said Rhaegar after several long moments of observation. Before she could speak on this answer, the group parted to let a figure through, and Rhaella felt her eyebrow raise as a woman stepped forward. She was beautiful, and though not a look-alike, it was clear she was related to Lyanna Stark, perhaps the sister she spoke of in the Beyond. Looking over to Aerys, she was pleased to note he looked intrigued in the new arrival instead of insulted. "Well, now it seems Lord Stark has sent quite a group to see me. I recognize the Karstark and Manderley sigils, but not you, my lady," said Aerys. "My name is Branda Stark, your grace," said the woman, surprising many judging by the murmuring of the crowd. "That would make you Lady Stark's elder sister, however I was told you were living in the Stormlands," said Aerys. I was married into House Amberley. My husband died in the war, however, and we had no children. Rather than stay and become a burden, I elected to return home where I could be of use," said the woman. "Then tell me, my lady, why has your lord sent you here?" questioned Aerys. "A few reasons. The first is to inform you that House Bolton is now extinct. Their castle, the Dreadfort, has been burned to its foundations and its remains seized by House Stark. The maester in charge of the Dreadfort, Barnaby, has been executed for failing to report the crimes of the late Lord Bolton," said Lady Stark, stunning the room. "Oh, and what crimes were committed?" questioned Aerys. "They were hunting and terrorizing the small folk for sport, feeding them to dogs. Worse still, they were flaying them, some of them while they were still alive. Thus they broke the treaty between our houses, and as such Lord Stark executed the penalty as written as part of that treaty," said the woman, much to the horror and disgust of many in the room. Even Tywin looked taken aback. "And the maester?" questioned Aerys. "He failed to report this, and when confronted stated he didn't answer to the Starks, only the Citadel." Lord Stark corrected him on this notion. "My king, Lord Stark was out of line. Maesters answer only to the Citadel," stated Grand Maester Pycelle. "Not in the north, fool. That was one of the agreed-upon terms between Aegon and Torhen, just for us to not kill you fools for daring to try entering our lands again," said Lady Branda quickly. "If I may, your grace," spoke Tywin, getting a nod from Aerys. "Why wasn't a raven sent explaining this news?" questioned Tywin. "It was unwise. 2 maesters have been executed. Lord Stark doesn't trust other maesters to tell you the whole truth of what is reported, instead of trying to enact vengeance in error like this fool did," said the woman. "2 maesters?" questioned Aerys. "Maester Whaleys, the one assigned to Winterfell, was executed for treason. It was discovered he'd been poisoning my sister. She'd have died in the birthing bed or lost her child were it not discovered and corrected in time." The silence that met this was deafening, and even Aerys and Tywin were affected this time. "Offer my congratulations to Lord Stark on the birth of his child on your return. This would be his 3rd child as well, correct?" said the king after a moment to regain himself. Fourth, Your Grace. My niece Lyanna was born just last year. This one was a boy named Benjen, said the woman. It seems Lord Stark is quite fortunate in that way. How was the poisoning discovered? Remarked and questioned Tywin. A healer, my father apparently befriended during his wanderer days. She and her husband are on a tour of the world and came to pay their respects. She discovered and neutralized the poison quite easily. Anything else? Questioned Aerys. Yes. Lord Stark has a number of projects in the works. The navy is being rebuilt in order to rebuff and discourage further Ironborn attacks on our people. He also plans to open up White Harbor for greater trade. The Company of Roses is returning to the north and the Fangs of Fenrir have been reactivated. Finally, he will be trying to treat with the wildlings in order to stop the attacks on our people, said Lady Branda. It seems you all have much work ahead then. Tell me, what are you offering in trade? Questioned Aerys. That I haven't been informed of, Your Grace. That night found a tired Rhaella relaxing in her room. She was currently in the bath, though nothing of her could be seen due to the soap suds in the water. The meeting had lasted a little longer and they'd been surprised again as Lord Stark had sent 5 years' worth of taxes so that he would be free to work on his projects with no worry. It had surprised everyone that Lord Stark had enough coin on hand that he could do such a thing and still have enough to cover his new projects. She knew that any other lord in his position would have needed to take out a loan from the Iron Throne just to do just one of his bigger projects. But Lord Stark had no need to. According to Branda, it was because Northerners weren't frivolous with their coin as their lands were too harsh even in the summer for such things. Even further shocking was that he'd been able to call back the Company of Roses, Northerners who'd left rather than give up their freedom to the Conqueror. Over the years many other Northerners had apparently joined that number, third and fourth sons, bastards or anyone just looking for a better life, especially since the wall had been turned into little more than a prison now due Southern interference. The meeting between them had ended shortly after and she'd had Rhaegar taken to begin his martial lessons by Esser Barristan. She'd had another more private meeting with Lady Stark in her solar where they covered a few more topics. It was in this meeting that she was presented with a letter from Lord Stark, one that was for only the eyes of herself and her husband. The letter had stated that the former apprentice of the healer who had seen to Lyanna Stark would be coming to Westeros as well only by way of Essos with her husband and that they would be stopping in King's Landing. In that letter had been details of the ship as well as the healer and her husband. She had as such quietly sent word to look out for the ship or the two individuals and escort them to her. Aerys was the only one she'd informed of this and after some brief explanation had agreed to keep it quiet and not start any digging of his own at this point. I thought I'd find you like this, came a voice cutting into her thoughts. Looking up she was greeted to the sight of Aerys. For a brief moment she was taken aback then quickly realized this wasn't the monster that had tormented her. This version of Aerys was still her brother and didn't see her as a Valyrian whore to slate his lusts on. She'd long since taken command of their lovemaking, taking her cue from the lessons she'd watched her daughter learn while submerged in the water before she began this new life. With Aerys she'd learned to use her cunt as a weapon which had allowed her to gain the influence she had over him. You'd soak yourself too if you had to experience the aches and pains of carrying a child, said Rhaella. This healer, did Lady Stark tell you how they discovered and removed the poison? Questioned Aerys. Magic. The word got the reaction she was expecting as his eyes went wide in surprise. Yes, apparently in the lands they hail from magic is widely practiced and many people have learned to use it to heal. I'm hopeful the healer that comes here will be able to help with Rhaegar as well, said Rhaella. Rhaegar? What's wrong with him? Questioned Aerys. He has dragon dreams. He doesn't realize it of course but he does. I'm hoping that perhaps there is some crossover between our magic and theirs. Enough at least to point him in the right direction so that he could control his visions, said Rhaella. How long has this been happening? Questioned the king. Not long and they come sporadically, sometimes months, even years apart. I didn't realize what they were until Lady Stark arrived today. He dreamed of her arrival months ago. You wish to know the future? Questioned Aerys, his tone surprised. No, the past. There is so much that was lost in the Doom, he could learn all of that. Plus why did the dragons die out? They say it was living in the pits but I don't believe it. With this ability he could answer so many questions, said Rhaella. The deserts of Dorne were a harsh place and was one of the hottest deserts in the known world, second only to the Red Waste in Essos in terms of size and heat, though its landscape was more diverse in appearance. It featured mountains, plateaus, sand and gravel-covered plains, salt flats, basins, depressions and most famously sand dunes, some of which stood taller than even the famous wall in the north. For Doran Martell this meant little to nothing as at 19 years of age he was now well used to traversing it. Elia and Oberyn, now 10 and 9 respectively, had been able to help him with the research, but the exploration was left to him with a carefully selected team. By this point the team had been with him on searches from up and down the River Rhoyne in Essos and across Dorne. To date they had found many things, among them historical artifacts they'd been praised for, but never what he'd been searching for. Over the past year Elia and Oberyn had been helping now that they had their memories of their past lives to call upon, and they'd found a few clues to point them in the right direction. He knew a few of his team were wondering what it was he was searching for, as after all they found he hadn't been satisfied, but none had given voice to it to him. Found something. The call broke him from his thoughts and had him looking over to the speaker. The speaker was a huge man by the name of Bolano, who stood nearly 8 feet in height, putting him at a size comparable to the mountain. He had black hair that was styled into individual box-style braids, courtesy of Elia, and dark skin that was rippling with muscles. Doran had found him in Pentos, a slave then only 14 yet taller than many grown men. Taking a page from the playbook of Daenerys Targaryen, he'd purchased him from his owner, then freed him. Bolano had agreed to stay with him in gratitude and had been with him for the last 5 years. Moving over to him, he found him standing looking over the ridge of the dune, and his team, numbering 12 including himself, were quick to move towards him. Coming to stand alongside him, he soon saw a spire buried into the sand. "Good work, Bolano," said Doran. "That looks like sandstone, and in pretty rough shape too." This speaker was Jared of House Dane. "Right, let's grab the tools and see if we can break our way in," spoke Corbin Sand, the son of Lord Traemond Gargalen, whom he himself had once squired for. "Grab some ladders as well, no sense making 2 trips. The last voice was Malario, his lover. Like the first time he met her on his tour of Essos while he'd been in Norvos. Only this time he'd taken things slower with her, not allowing the whirlwind of emotion and lust to dictate things as it had the last time. This time he'd seduced her with tales of adventure, traveling to see new places and discover their lost history, and as such they bonded as friends long before he'd taken her as a lover. She was now his closest confidant, outside of Elia and Oberyn, and was effectively his right hand. Also, unlike last time, he'd agreed to her learning to wield weapons, and now she was quite deadly with both a spear and a scimitar. As it was in the entirety of their party, she and Bolano were the only ones who knew exactly what he was searching for and why. It took nearly an hour, but they were able to make an entrance cutting a 4-foot block out of the tower, enough for them to slide through to enter. It was Evea Sand, the daughter of Lord Ormond Wyronwood, that was the first to see the inside. She was the shortest member of their party at 5 feet 3, but it meant nothing in the face of his skill as a warrior, nor did her beauty. Her size made her the perfect person for tight entrances, as not only was she short but she was also slim and flexible, which had worked out extremely well on their trips over the years. Crouching, she approached the edge of their man-made entrance and dropped a lit torch inside, watching for it to hit the bottom. "One ladder is enough, there's a stairway not far beneath us," said the young lady as she backed out of the hole. The ladders themselves were different than the ones most on the continent used, as instead of mostly wood they were made of rope with the wooden planks. They were only 50 feet in length but could be attached to each other to increase the length if necessary, as there were hooks on both ends of the ladders and latches to hold them in place. Soon enough the ladder was in place, and one by one they descended into the building, though they had to drop the last foot to land on the floor. Upon landing they quickly realized why there was a staircase, as windows were spaced every 10 feet going down the stairs, which were made of stone and despite the time that had passed showed not a single bit of wear on them from the ages. "The hell is this place?" questioned Aenar Dane as they traveled along the bottom, though he was from the cadet branch of High Hermitage, whereas Jared was of the main house of Starfall. "If our research was correct, we may have just found Nymeria's sanctuary." "Nymeria's what?" exclaimed Evea, spinning towards him in shock. "Nymeria's sanctuary. From what Elia, Oberyn and I were able to discover, it seems she had this place built in secret from the Dornish houses. Only her husband knew the place was being built. It houses all of the knowledge of the old Rhoynish city-states and anything else of value they could get away with." As they traversed the place, Doran was proven correct as they came across rooms with walls lined with wooden racks full of scrolls. There were statues made of gold and jade in another room, and others with weapons. Some rooms were empty of everything except boundary markers, which they guessed had been meant for some kind of training. Another room held nothing but a pool of water, while others contained sand and mounds of earth. Eventually the group split up, all going their own way for exploration. Doran himself traveled back to the scroll rooms only to find a woman standing in the center of the room. She stood only a bit taller than Evea, at probably around 5 feet 5, and had teal eyes with sandy blonde hair pulled into a pair of tails on the bottom of the back of her head. She wore a deep purple dress with a plunging neckline yet still managed to cover her breast and ran with a slit along her right side exposing her leg and sandal-covered foot. "Welcome Prince Doran to Sanctuary," said the woman causing his eyes to narrow. "Who are you?" questioned Doran cautiously. "You're cautious good, you have some sense about you. As to your question, I am Tamari, a friend of Naruto's." "I am honored to meet you my lady," said Doran with a bow getting a smirk from her. "Come young man, let me show you around." The sounds of clashing steel, thumping arrows, pounding hammers from the forges and cheering filled the air of Winterfell's grounds. It was a sound that over the last decade the castle's residents had become well used to, none more than the Starks of Winterfell themselves. At the moment the Lord and Lady of Winterfell could both be found standing on the bridge between the armory and the Great Keep as they watched over the events currently taking place. Below them in the space near the east gate an archery range could be seen which was currently in use by a group of kids, none of which could be older than 10, of which Benjen was a part of. Watching their youngest, both parents could only be filled with pride at the progress in his training and studies. Their children were all incredibly smart, though all of them had areas in which they were most interested. By this point all of them were fluid in both the old tongue as well as reading and writing of runes. Brandon of course had shown more interest in his martial training, an interest that had only increased when the memories of his old life had awakened. Eddard had been more studious than his brother, but after his memories awakened he'd learned to relax and began spending more time with his siblings. Lyanna had always been more interested in history, but she'd flourished in her martial studies and though not yet fully trained was clearly a cut above the rest of her age. Her memories had only awakened earlier in the year and after her brief bout of depression had taken to her lessons with a fervor never before seen in her. As for Benjen, like before he was Lyanna's shadow and as she moved he moved, this had become especially true when his memories woke and the two were seemingly joined at the hip for the most part. They were also studying magic under Jiraiya and Tsunade. Under their guidance all of the Stark family could now warg into the skin of an animal with complete control. At this point all of them had goshawks that they were now bonded with. On top of that Jiraiya was their teacher for runic and elemental magic while Tsunade taught them healing magic. Runic magic was something that he personally had taken a fast liking to while Liara was more focused on healing, which took her much longer to learn. Finally they were also learning combat magic, more specifically elemental magic. According to Jiraiya they all had the potential to one day use ice magic as all of them had affinities for its base elements of wind and water. They could rapidly cool the water to transform it into ice, but Jiraiya had stated to create ice from nothing with both elements being manipulated at once. This ability is apparently what had allowed Brandon the Builder to raise the wall, though it was a combination of others' spells and runes that maintained it. As things stood Brandon favored using wind magic whereas Eddard favored water, and while both could use the other element neither could combine the two at this point. Lord Rickard himself also favored one over the other, his being wind, while Liara favored water as she could use it as a medium for healing. Lyanna and Benjen however have not yet started their advanced training in this regard. They however weren't the only people training in Winterfell, however, for the castle had played or was playing host to every heir in the north. Not only them but commoners were also being trained in the arts of combat, though in those instances that was taken care of by those lords they lived nearest to. Of course not everyone was interested in combat and there were many that were learning smithing, hunting or any number of things. They also had people who were interested in more intellectual pursuits and many of them would go on be sent to White Harbor to study at the academy there before going on to work in their bank Frostmourne after the Sword of Bran the Builder, or any number of fields that became available to them. The bank itself had been built in White Harbor, which had indeed become a true trading hub. The bank and White Harbor itself was guarded over by members of the Fangs of Fenrir or the Black Wolves, the mercenary company once known as the Company of Roses. Leaving their youngest to his fun, the two continued their walk around the grounds. As they walked they passed both the armorers and the crafter workshops. These buildings were big, much bigger than they'd have previously been. For the armorer it was because more updated means of crafting armors had been discovered and more space had been required. The crafters however were a mixed group and worked on anything from furniture to instruments. Some of the instruments were things that had been discovered in other lands and had been brought back, such as the piano and violin. One of the requirements that Jiraiya and Tsunade had set when it came to the training of people was that all of them learn to play at least one instrument. Considering the nature of that group, the two of them could certainly understand why. Eventually the duo found themselves entering the first keep. It had been rebuilt over the last decade and now acted as a small learning center more than anything. It was here that children were taught the more theoretical knowledge before they moved on to the more physical pursuits. They were taught not only numbers, but history, languages, the arts and geography. There were also other more practical classes that they could elect to take and would help them later in life. This rather high level of education had already seen success with not only the staffing of the bank but in other areas as well, such as hunters, fishermen, and even farming. As with the courses, the instructors were a varied bunch and hailed from a host of different places and some even from other continents. The North was flourishing, and all knew it was due to the plans and actions of the Lord and Lady Stark. Moving through the ground floor of the keep, they passed a few classes that were in session until they came to the room they were seeking. The room in question held a number of young girls, all of whom were concentrating on some parchment that stood on easels before them. Moving slowly around the room was a woman by the name of Ada Zumbe, who, while dressed as a northerner, was a foreigner who would not look out of place on the Summer Islands but hailed from the continent of Aegala, from a country called Rowan. She was a dark-skinned woman with short-cut black hair. She was slim with a slim waist, wide hips, and big breasts. She was a true beauty, and if that wasn't enough, was one of the kindest people he'd ever met. She was in charge of the sewing lessons of the ladies, as the making of clothing was her passion. "Lord and Lady Stark, how can I help you?" The woman spoke quietly, and only once she stood in front of them. She spoke with an accent that gave her voice power, did nothing to take away from her femininity. She was the fourth daughter of a Rhoenian nobleman who controlled the ports, and her marriage had been part of the negotiations for trade with her people. She had married a man who was now a captain of one of their trade ships by the name of Exharara Taxos, a Summer Islander who'd been captured by slavers and freed after the ship ran afoul of the then Company of Roses 10 years ago. He, like many of the men that had been captured, had joined the company in gratitude, while the women had been returned to the islands. "We first wish to inform you the Gale has docked in White Harbor," said Lady Stark, getting a large smile from the other woman, as this was the name of her husband's ship. "Second, we wish to know how Lyanna has taken to your class," said Rickard. "She's getting better. I think she'll always be more comfortable with a weapon in hand, but if she maintains her level of focus and determination, she could also be quite the seamstress," said Ada. "What of Caitlin?" questioned Liara. Caitlin Tully had been taken as a ward of theirs as part of an alliance with the Riverlands that would allow them to ship their wares over land, giving them access to the rest of the South for land trade. This alliance included her marriage to the next Lord of Winterfell. It was for this reason that she'd been brought north at just 12, and while she had now been there for a year, they made regular checks with her instructors to see how she was doing. Lady Caitlin was already quite skilled when she first started with us, as you know. However, I am pleased to inform you that her attitude has improved remarkably since her arrival. No one has threatened her in a few months from what I hear," said Ada, causing Rickard to chuckle. Caitlin's attitude had not endeared her to many when she'd first arrived. Having been raised in the South and Riverrun of all places, she'd had many of their ideals. Lyanna certainly hadn't been impressed and hadn't even hesitated before punching the girl in the mouth. The other children hadn't been as quick to strike her, especially the common-born, but they'd taken their turns in sparring seasons, not only beating her but mocking her lack of skill for her age. They'd only allowed one person to join her from Riverrun, and that had been her uncle Esser Bryndon Tully, otherwise known as the Blackfish, who had not been happy at her treatment. Liara had taken great pleasure in informing the Southron Knight that they were now in the north, and the girl would need the humbling before she would be accepted by their people, and mocking their religion as she had her disrespecting people like she did wouldn't be tolerated by her peers. It hadn't taken long for the girl to realize that her southern heritage was not looked at well here, and soon she had started adjusting and showing improvements. "Thank you, Lady Ada. We'll let you get back to your students," said Liara. Lady Ada gave a short bow of the head before turning away and resuming her vigil over the room. Leaving her to her duties, the duo left the room and split as each went on to see about their own individual duties. White Harbor was a beautiful place located on the eastern shore of the White Knife. It is clean and well ordered, with wide straight cobbled streets that make it easy to walk around. The houses are built of whitewashed stone, with steeply pitched roofs of dark gray slate. Though once a small port, it had transformed into a true city, the largest in the north even before the changes brought about by the Lord Stark. In the last 10 years it had grown even more and was now home to all manner of craftsmen offering everywhere possible, and one can even find the occasional conman or shady dealer in the shadows. Its growth could be attributed to two things: Frostmourne, otherwise known as the Bank of the North, and the fleet of ships that sat in the port. Another thing that contributed to its size was the Academy, an institute of higher learning with a student population that numbered in the mid-hundreds and was steadily growing each year. Like the Winterfell and the other northern castles, they had a number of core classes that included basic numbers, history, languages, the arts, and geography. They also taught advanced arithmetic, medicine, chemistry, astrology, and for a select number of students, politics. Because of the number of people that frequented the city, a number of taverns, inns, and brothels had appeared within the city. All in all, the place was becoming a haven for students, artists, scholars, and freethinkers. Standing upon one of the ships taking it all in was a young man on the cusps of adulthood. The young man in question was Brandon Stark, and though only 15 he stood tall at 5 feet 8 inches, and many felt he would no doubt reach and even surpass 6 feet in height. He wore a dark brown robes, with a gray hood currently down, the front of which ended near his shins, accented with a large dark gray stripe that ran down the center of his front, the interior of which was padded for protection and lined with fur for warmth that led to a pair of matching pants and boots. At his sides were a pair of short, slightly curved swords known as cutlass types, while a bow was strapped to his back and his forearms were covered by a pair of bracers. His blades were uniquely made in that they measured at 33.5 inches, with a blade that was 27 inches that was made from ethium, which was a new metal found in the northern mountains that was similar to Valyrian steel in that it was lighter and stronger than regular steel, though it was bolstered by the ability to channel magic through them. "Hell of a view, isn't it?" said a voice from behind him. Turning, he was greeted to the sight of John Umber, the Airhouse Umber of Last Hearth. He was now 18 and stood at around 6 feet 4 inches when last they checked. Most people were awed that he was still growing, but Brandon, with his knowledge of the times that had once been, knew the man would get much taller still. "Aye, to think just how much of it had been under construction just a few years ago," said Brandon. "How long do you plan to stay?" questioned John. "Lord Manderley will most likely invite us to feast tonight so he can hear of our travels. If so, I'll have a lie-in tomorrow and head for Winterfell the day after," said Brandon after a few moments of thought. "There you guys are." The new voice had both, turning to be greeted by a pair of figures. One was a young woman who they knew as Barbie Ryswell, daughter of Lord Roderick Ryswell. She was tall for a woman at nearly 5 feet 10 inches and shapely thanks largely to her training. The other was a young man by the name of Elbert Arryn, the nephew and heir of Lord John Arryn of the Vale. Unlike last time through, the two of them had been fostered in Winterfell, as had John Umber. The three Northerners, as well as his younger brother Eddard, had been amongst the first group to train under Jiraiya and the then Company of the Rose. Elbert had arrived a few years later, and they'd pulled him into their circle when he began training with them. Of the group, Eddard, or Ned as they called him, was the only one who had not been permitted to take the trip with them. Instead, he'd once again been sent to the Vale to foster under Lord John Arryn nearly a year ago now. Both of them were dressed similarly to how he himself were, though there were differences in terms of cut, color, and armaments. "Why are you guys still here?" questioned Elbert. He'd thought for sure they'd have already found a tavern. "Waiting on the bankers to finish the inventory." "Well, hopefully they finish soon. I don't think I'm the only one who can think of doing something better than standing around here," said Barbie. This was true, though what went unspoken was that they were also sure they knew exactly what it was Barbie was hoping for. This only made Brandon wish they would hurry more, as while not the best he had been with, he would never pass up an opportunity to be wrapped between her thighs. A few hours later found Brandon sitting up on the edge of a bed as he went about placing his boots back on his feet. His torso was bare, revealing his upper body as somewhat bulky and covered with muscles, something of a boxer's build according to Jiraiya. Another thing revealed, however, were the tattoos which covered his frame. Covering the left side of his chest was the head of a direwolf with a banner fluttering under it with his house words, "Winter is coming," written on each piece of the banner, all of it in black ink. The neck of the wolf ran over his shoulder, the arm of which was almost completely covered something that was called a sleeve. At the top near his shoulder was the Aegis-Hjalmar, or Helm of Awe, which was a symbol of protection, while the rest of the arm down to the end of his forearm was covered by tribal designs, though other symbols, these runes, could be seen spaced out throughout it. "Leaving already?" Looking over his shoulder for a moment, he was greeted to the sight of Barbie as she slid out of the bed and moved over to a nearby table, not even bothering to cover her nudity. Her body was marked with fewer and smaller tattoos than his own, such as her house's sigil on the back of her right shoulder. Her brown hair was in disarray, and she did nothing to fix it, focused instead on pouring herself a drink. I need to bathe and then go see Jiraiya," said Brandon, turning away from her and slipping his shirt on. "Right then, if I don't see you tonight, I'll see you when it's time to head back out," said the girl. Nearly an hour later found him walking through the halls of the castle fresh from his bath. He wore a new set of robes, this one more appropriate for the cold of the north than the ones he wore at sea or in other countries. The robes were something that had been brought to them by Jiraiya and had become the uniform of the Fangs of Fenrir. This one was made of brown leather, while his forearms were covered by a pair of vambraces, and a deep red sash was secured around his waist, and holding it in place was a buckle that was formed by the symbol of their order, which was a pair of upside-down axes connected at the end knob. Completing his outfit was a cape with a furred collar. What went unseen, however, were the runes on that regulated the temperature for the weather in effect, ensuring that the body never got too warm or worse, too cold. These days most people in the north had something that helped them regulate their body's temperature and as such to survive the cold that permeated the north. He found Jiraiya outside leaning against the railing of a connecting bridge overlooking a courtyard while he smoked his pipe. Down below he could see a group of trainees as they went about their bow practice. A bit further away was another group, this one being more physical, as they sparred with kunai knives. These knives were something that Jiraiya had revealed in a multi-purpose tool. Farmers could use them to dig holes, and he knew they were used in the mines and even for construction projects. The leaf-shaped blades were usually left unsharpened due to its usual method of use. When used for combat, however, they were quite versatile, as it could be used as a stabbing weapon, a throwing weapon, or by tying rope to the ringed end could become what they called a rope dart and used for grappling and even a bit of distance combat. "Welcome back, brat. How was your trip?" said Jiraiya, breaking him from his observation. "It was incredible. I had no idea the world was so big or that there would be so much in it," said Brandon with a smile. "And you've only seen a small part of it. There are so many places in this world of ours. To experience it all would be the work of a lifetime," said Jiraiya, laughing. "I'm looking forward to seeing more of it though," said Brandon. "You'll need to wait a while. I'm putting your team on standby. Things have gotten interesting while you've been away." For Princess Elia Nymeros Martell, this second life was one she found herself thankful for every time she awoke. Now 20 years old, she could say that she was enjoying this new life much more than she had her previous one. The first time through she'd struggled through it as she'd always been sickly. This time she'd been cured when she was just 10 years old. Doran had returned from one of his expeditions and surprised everyone when he'd returned with a guest, a woman named Sakura that was revealed to be a healer who had proceeded to heal her with water magic. The woman had stated that her mother had most likely been fed poison while she'd been pregnant with her, and that had caused damage in her development, resulting in her previously frail state. This reveal had caused her mother to order a search and seizure of the maester's quarters. The seizing of his journals revealed that he had indeed poisoned her mother, resulting in several miscarriages and the deaths of her elder brothers Morse and Oliver, who died during their infancy. Her mother had the man beheaded, and Doran had gone to King's Landing escorting Sakura, who'd already been heading that way. That at least was the official story. In truth, from what Doran had told them privately, Sakura was a goddess who specialized in healing. She had been tasked by Naruto to see to her recovery and had been summoned by another goddess named Tamari when Doran had come across her in Nymeria's sanctuary. Whatever the case, she had recovered wonderfully, which had resulted in changes to her adult body. The first time through she'd barely been 5 feet in height, skinny and flat-chested as an adult even after the birth of her children. Now she stood at 5 feet 7 inches with a decent bust size, and while still skinny she had a curve to her figure and was also a bit muscular. All told, she looked and felt much better than she had the last time through. Regardless, with her new lease on life, she'd taken full advantage of her time. Doran had discovered heaps of knowledge within Nymeria's sanctuary, including forms of water and earth magic called bending, and she had devoured it all. In the last 10 years she'd learned a lot, such as how to fight as well as bend the elements. This ability was performed through the motions of one's hands and feet, though it was a tier system, with a master able to do it all with minimal movement and a grandmaster be able to use the ability simply through their will and focus with no outward motion. As of now, she was one of very few who could use water, earth and the earth's sub-ability of sand manipulation, and the only one who was considered an expert in all three and had done it all by the time she was 16. In that time her mother had still taken her and Oberyn on the betrothal tour, and just as she remembered, none of it had worked out as she'd hoped. This time, however, she convinced her mother to skip the Lannisters altogether. After this, she'd been given the option to travel her own path and had headed to the north to study at the Academy of White Harbor. She had barely gotten off the ship when she was greeted a group which included the Lord Stark himself. She'd been invited to stay in Winterfell and study under the master healer Tsunade and had not been able to turn it down. She'd stayed in Winterfell for 3 years, learning everything Lady Tsunade had to teach her. More than that, though, she'd gotten to spend time with Lyanna, and while for a while she hadn't remembered her, it had been nice to see a purely innocent version of her who just wanted to learn and have fun. When Lyanna's memories had finally awakened, she'd been there when she'd broken down and cried and listed while she ranted and swore vengeance. She'd left Winterfell only a few months later and returned to Dorne, but in that time she and Lyanna had bonded and come up with several new ideas all their own. Upon her return, she had immediately gone to work, as she and Doran had led a major project, much to her surprise. With the knowledge of the bending arts at their disposal and a fairly high number of their people capable of it, her mother had tasked the two of them in the construction of a series of underground canals that would spread all over Dorne, giving their land access to free water. Despite their ability to bend elements, however, the project was proving to be a long and taxing one. At the moment, she was resting inside of a large tunnel she had helped erect in order for them to dig the trenches that would allow the water to flow from its source to their target destination, in this case being Sandstone, the seat of House Corgyle, where her brother Oberyn had fostered for a few years when he'd been younger. Unfortunately, her younger brother was not available for this task. Oberyn was instead tracing his previous steps in an effort to bring about the births of his daughters and to re-establish his legend. As it was, the only difference was that he'd not killed Lord Edgar Wyronwood when they held their duel, and she had been there in order and managed to heal him. Oberyn had still ended up with his nickname, the Red Viper. Also, unlike last time, he'd not stayed long in Aldtown and left shortly after Obara was born. Also, unlike last time, he'd not just taken the child from her mother but invited the mother to come to Dorne and set her up with a house, a bit of coin, and had someone teach her a more respectable trade, and she now worked as a seamstress. After that was done, Oberyn had also traveled north but had stayed in White Harbor and attended the academy before leaving for Essos. That said, she had not lost track of time, and she knew the time for preparation would be coming to an end. Soon it would be time to publicly enter the Game of Thrones, and this time they would be playing to win. Located at the mouth of Blackwater Bay was the volcanic island of Dragonstone. The island's biggest feature was the active volcano that had over time become known as the Dragonmont, and it was on the face of the mountain beneath the volcano that the castle of Dragonstone could be found. The castle itself had been constructed using Valyrian sorcery, fire magic that had enabled its builder to shape its construction to their liking, and as such allowed the upper stone towers to resemble dragons. Dragon architecture can be found throughout the castle, such as small dragons framing gates and dragon claws holding torches, while a pair of great wings cover the armory and smithy, while dragon tails form archways and staircases. Nearly 500 years old, the castle was the original seat of House Targaryen in Westeros, though it had once merely been the westernmost outpost of the Valyrian freehold. Since the conquest, it has served as the seat of heir apparent titled the Prince of Dragonstone. The current Prince of Dragonstone, Rhaegar Targaryen, had called the place home for the last few years, much earlier than he had in his original life. This change, however, was needed as the privacy afforded by Dragonstone was invaluable to his training. When he'd first come to Dragonstone, it had been when his mother, in the later stages of her pregnancy, with a small party that consisted of the two of them, Esser Barristan Selmy and Prince Lewin Martell of the Kingsguard, as well as a healer named Sakura and her husband Sasuke Uchiha. It wasn't until his memories awoke a few days after they arrived on Dragonstone that he'd learned that they had been sent to aid his family by Naruto. Before that time, Sakura had helped his mother birth a set of twins, Shayna and Darren Targaryen. A gift from Naruto is that they'd both died as babies the first time around. His father had been elated but had apparently demanded the three stay on Dragonstone, where there was no maester trying to kill them. His mother and the twins had eventually moved back to King's Landing, but he had stayed to train under Esser Barristan and Sasuke. While Esser Barristan trained him as a knight, Sasuke had trained him in magic. He'd helped him learn to manipulate his dragon dreams while he was awake, which allowed him to peer into both the past and the future. When he was younger, he'd been surprised his presence was recognized by a group of Valyrian sorcerers he decided to watch, who had revealed that he was using an ability they called astral projection, which was allowing his spirit to travel into the past. Dragon dreams were apparently an unfocused and uncontrolled version of this ability. He studied under them for the next few years, learning all that he could, including a type of fire magic that they called firebending, an advanced sub-ability they called lavabending, and how to hatch, bond with and care for dragons. They'd also taught him another kind of fire magic, though this one with a wider area of effect. It had taken a few months, but once he'd learned everything they had to teach him, he was informed that he would not be able to see them again for some time and that he should focus on his role in the times to come. Unfortunately, he also learned that learning something this way did not mean his body was capable of doing it, and he'd still have to train his body to use what he'd learned. While he had trained himself in all aspects, he knew he still had a ways to go until he even thought about trying to gain mastery over any of it. Following his training under the ancient sorcerers, he'd looked into more recent past events, starting with Aegon and his sister wives Visenya and Rhaenys. He could see that history had gotten much wrong about their relationship, but it had deteriorated in time, though not without influence from septons, maesters and scheming lords. Following this, he'd looked into other troubling periods for his family and found that whenever things reached their worst for his family, it was due to the manipulation of the Citadel and the septons, and usually through the manipulation of other lords. Even the Dance of Dragons and their decline had been at the hands of these groups. Thankfully the Citadel had already lost a lot of prestige with the lords as their actions against the houses of Stark and Martell had become known. The maesters had by this point been completely ejected from Dorne. When he was 15 it was determined that he had finished his training, and having proved himself in a few tourneys he'd been knighted by Ser Barristan. Having focused more on his martial training this time, even though he still kept his studious nature, he had grown to progress a more powerful form. Training under Sasuke's influence, his body had not been built just for strength but for flexibility and speed, and as such he wasn't bulky with muscles. In truth, while a bit bigger than he'd been the last time through as a full-grown adult, as he now possessed a medium frame and was covered in compacted muscles with very little fat, and he was also taller than he'd been at the same age last time. Following his knighting he began to spend more time in King's Landing, though over the last year his time there had been less plentiful, and he'd returned to Dragonstone with his siblings, having successfully convinced his father to allow it. It had been his desire to pass to them some of the lost Valyrian knowledge he'd gained that had won out in the end. This time the Kingsguard assigned had been Ser Lewin Martell, and they'd been accompanied by his best friend, the Sword of the Morning, Ser Arthur Dane, for whom Darren was a squire. He was most impressed with Shayna, as she'd taken to magic and combat as if it were second nature to her, so much so that he sometimes thought she was Visenya reborn. He was thankful for that, as with their rate of growth he was hopeful that he could complete their training before their time expired, as if all else failed they'd be the ones passing the lessons on to the next generation, though he had no intention of dying this time around. The future as always was uncertain. To say that the mood within the Red Keep was tense would be an understatement. Of course, for those who spent a significant amount of time within the keep there had existed an wariness about the place for quite some time, a standoff between the king and his hand that all knew of but never spoke on. This standoff existed for many a reason, but the main one was that Aerys was considered the king in name, while it was said Tywin was the one who truly ruled. Most would also point to the shift of the power dynamic as being when the Queen had taken an extended stay on Dragonstone prior to the birth of the twins, and Tywin had taken the opportunity to appoint a new Master of Coin in Lord Quarlton Chelsted, and Lord Royce was dismissed as Master of Law in favor of Lord Simon Staunton. The whispers say the Queen had been furious to discover this upon her return from Dragonstone, but had relented in exchange for the education of the twins to be her responsibility, with a few other unknown conditions as well. This had not been helped that in the years since the birth of the twins she'd had 3 more miscarriages, and Prince Viserys, now little more than a year old, had only been born when the Queen had decided to return to Dragonstone for the duration of her pregnancy. Of course, in those years the relationship between Aerys and Tywin had become incredibly strained due to a number of factors, and had been destroyed after the death of Lady Joanna Lannister, rumored to have once been the king's mistress, had died in the birthing bed bringing forth the dwarf Tyrion Lannister. This history, however, currently meant nothing to Queen, who was clearly furious. For Rhaella herself, her fury was born not from the situation but that she had been unable to prevent it. Over the years she and Aerys had grown closer, yet she'd been able to do nothing but watch as he transformed into the monster yet again. He'd yet to act against her in any way. Not even the mistresses had truly bothered her, though she'd drawn the line when he once again tried to lay with her ladies. No, her fury was due to what she knew was coming, and the fact that she'd be unable to do anything to stop it. The Mad King was coming. It was inevitable, as he'd already been held in Duskendale for nearly 5 months now, and in her original life he'd been a captive for half a year. That meant the time to act was now. As if the thought was a spell, she found her quarry after turning the next corner and had to withhold a grimace at the action she was about to take. Her target was a man she had never liked nor trusted, and with her knowledge of the once future events she was evidently right. The figure in question was a man, plump and bald, who wore robes that appeared to be a rich velvet color made of silk. He was not a terribly tall man, standing at perhaps 5 feet 8, and smelled of lavender. This man was none other than Varys, otherwise known as the Spider, and the Master of Whispers. In truth, when he'd first come to them she had wanted to simply kill him, but Sakura had stated he was a necessary evil for the big picture, so she'd ignored the urge. "Lord Varys, a word," stated Rhaella, causing the man to stop at her approach. "My queen," greeted the man with a short bow. "We have need of your services," said Rhaella, the use of the royal "we" a sign of her seriousness, as she rarely used it and only when she truly meant business. "How might I be of service?" questioned the man. "You will travel north to Winterfell and inform the Lord Stark that we require the aid of his fangs. You will inform him of the current situation and that we will reward him greatly upon the king's safe return. A ship will be ready to take you tonight," said Rhaella. "Of course, my queen," said the man with a short bow. "One last thing," said the queen, stopping him short. "Ser Barristan will accompany you. He will add credibility to your presence, and furthermore will travel with those who undertake this mission. You are dismissed." "Is it wise to trust him?" My queen? Questioned her shadow for the day Sir Gerald Hightower, Lord Commander of the Kingsguard. No, that's why I'm sending Sir Barristan with him. Better the eunuch than the maester who would relay word to Tywin first. Now let us go check on Viserys. Sir Oswell can keep us company while you brief Sir Barristan of his mission. Jiraiya had seen many things over his existence. His first life as a shinobi had been a hard one full of obstacles, pain and failure. His biggest failure he felt had been with Naruto, allowing him to stay and be raised in their home village of Konoha despite his instincts at the words of his teacher. Because of this, his profession as a spymaster and what that entailed, he'd only gotten to spend around 3 years total with his godson before he was killed. Despite this, upon his ascension to godhood, his godson, now a man who'd lived a full life, had not hesitated in raising him from the dead and allowing him the opportunity for a new life. Upon his own ascension, many, including Jiraiya, were surprised in that he was created as a god of love, based solely on the love and dedication he'd always had for Tsunade. Of course, he was also a god of lust, battle, and hermits, but love was his main domain, and he and Tsunade married not long after this reveal. Over time, immortality had allowed him to see many things, none as awe-inspiring as the metaphysical form that was the world tree in its true state, but many things that had impressed him, nonetheless. He and Tsunade had traveled many the multiverse in that time, often descending to the mortal realm to live as humans to see if they'd find each other again, which they always did. It was one of these lives in particular that had an effect on him even now. In a different reality in Egypt, in the town of Siwa, he had embedded his spirit into a stillborn baby that would be called Bayek, the last of the Magi, the protectors of Egypt. Tsunade had in the same way become Aya of Alexandria, later known as Amunet. They went through many trails and hardships, but together founded a group known as the Hidden Ones, which later evolved and became known as the Brotherhood of Assassins. Naruto and his father Minato were also members of the Brotherhood. Naruto had even lived the lives of 2 rather legendary assassins, but those were stories for another time. Upon being given the invitation to come to this reality, he and Tsunade had jumped at the opportunity. Honestly, how he had let everything get so fucked up he still had no idea. Still, it was in this image that he had created the Fangs of Fenrir, or Black Wolves, teaching them everything including the tenets of the creed. Brandon Stark, who he saw much of himself in, had become his apprentice, and only the third that he'd taken as himself. Of course, he was also an accomplished spymaster, and as such the Fangs of Fenrir were more than just warriors, and he had plans for an even greater expansion. As of now, he had ears in all of the major territories in Westeros and a few in Essos. As such, he had known of Varys' mission long before the man's arrival and had people on him before his ship had even docked. While it was not the first time the man had come north, it was the first time he'd come undisguised, and as such his first official trip, and as such he was there to greet him himself as he and Sir Barristan stepped off of the ship. That had been a few days ago. As of now, he could be found riding beside the 2 men with a small group of guards as they ran for Winterfell. Varys had apparently been quite surprised when he'd not been provided a wheelhouse but a horse, but he was a grown man and would be treated as such. The man hadn't complained, which was a point in his favor, but he still knew better than to trust him. Honestly, he'd rather just kill him and be done with it, but Varys was needed for the timeline they envisioned to play out. The travel had been quite easy for the last few days, and Winterfell was actually quite close, easily in viewing distance, and as such he was not surprised when they were met by a group of riders. "Lord Jiraiya, good to see you again so soon," said one of the riders, which Varys was surprised was a young woman. "You as well, Nyla. Tell me how your father is doing," returned Jiraiya. "He has recovered well, my lord. Please extend my thanks to Lady Tsunade again when you see her," said the young lady. "Of course. Now I need one of you to inform Lord Stark of our approach and that we are escorting an important guest," said Jiraiya. "Darren," called the girl, causing one of the 3 boys with her to nod before he rode off to Winterfell at a fast pace. A bit over 30 minutes later found the group riding through the gates of Winterfell with their escorts. For Varys, though he'd been silent, for the most part he'd been listening, and what he had learned was enlightening. Like himself, this man Jiraiya was clearly a foreigner, yet the people held him in high esteem. Furthermore, it was clear that it wasn't just the people who knew of him, but that he knew them, as he'd yet to fail to acknowledge anyone by name. The man at just over 6 feet in height was clearly a warrior, and he'd known that the people of the North were supposed to respect strength, but now he was truly seeing it. He'd also been surprised to learn that it was his wife that was the mentor to Lady Sakura, the healer who delivered the royal twins and Prince Viserys. They'd been met at the gate by not just Lord Stark but his wife and heir as well. He was informed he had 3 more children, but one was currently in the Vale and the 2 youngest were attending their lessons presently. Not long later, after the proper formal greetings were exchanged, he and Esser Barristan were escorted to their rooms to freshen up, and an hour later he found himself seated within the Lord's Solar along with Jiraiya, Brandon Stark and Lady Stark. "So Lord Varys, Esser Barristan, how can the North be of service to the Iron Throne?" said Lord Stark. "You knew?" questioned Esser Barristan in surprise. "You may have dressed as a commoner, but any of my people would know a member of the Kingsguard by sight, especially one of your reputation." "The Queen is requesting your aid," said Varys. "You're being straightforward. Good. Someone must have informed you those southern games would be looked down on here," said Lady Stark. "5 months ago the king was taken prisoner. The Queen is requesting the aid of your fangs in freeing him. In return she has promised you will be greatly rewarded," said Varys. "Where is he being held?" questioned Lady Liara. "Duskendale. Which would explain why Tywin moved such a large host there," said Lord Stark thoughtfully. "He'd still have to get through the city and then siege the Dun Fort though," said Brandon shaking his head. "You up for it?" questioned Jiraiya. "Yeah, sure," said Brandon without any hesitation. "Gather your team. You guys can take the javelin from White Harbor to Maidenpool, approach Duskendale from the back end," said Lord Stark. "Aye, that could work. We could slip in while they're distracted by Tywin and his forces," said Brandon. "Let them know, then get some rest. You can head out in the morning. I'm sure Esser Barristan would like to go with you. Besides, it would be better for someone he knows to be with you. He's most likely quite paranoid by now," said Jiraiya. "Of course," said Brandon before excusing himself. The Javelin was a beauty of a ship, the likes of which Esser Barristan had never before beheld. It was a huge vessel at 167 featuring 50 meters. It was a 3-mast ship that despite its size moved quickly, reducing a 2-week 3-day journey to one that had lasted a week and 2 days. True to the plan, they had disembarked the ship in Maidenpool and rode horse to Duskendale. Brandon's team consisted Barbie Risewell, John Umber and surprisingly Elbert Aaron, all of them heirs to powerful houses, the last of which was the heir of the Vale. Due to the siege currently taking place outside of the gates, they'd been able to scale the walls on the side of the town and enter unnoticed. They'd spent a few days in the town scouting it out and getting to know the temperament of its people. For himself, Esser Barristan found he was learning quite a bit about his new comrades and the way they operated, as well as a few new skills. Brandon Stark was clearly a capable leader, though that could be said for all of them, as they all clearly had working brains that they made use of. They could easily work independently of each other, but were an even better team and trusted each other implicitly. The plan they'd come up with to infiltrate the Dun Fort was quite devious, and he himself hadn't been able to find any flaws in their reasoning. Hell, they'd come up with things he'd have never even thought of, such as disabling alarm systems, taking out anyone important to the command structure, and securing a means of escape. For one person all of this would seem like a lot and something could easily be forgotten, but for a team of people the work was able to be divided up. Barbie would take care to disable the alarm bells, Eldrick would take out the top commanders, those being the Master-at-Arms and the Captain of the Guard, and John would be securing the means of their escape. He and Brandon meanwhile would be infiltrating the fort to rescue the king, and to make things easier they'd gotten him a guard's uniform so that he would better blend in. With the uniform, infiltrating the keep had been a simple thing, as they'd simply let him in. The guards were going in and out and they weren't even checking for identities. The helms they all wore didn't help in this problem, as the one he currently wore covered everything but his eyes, nose, mouth and chin, thanks to the T-shaped cutout of its center. Such a thing would never happen in King's Landing. He and his brothers of the Kingsguard knew every member of the castle guard by face if not by name. As for the helms, they would only wear them when on an active battlefield, never for a regular guard shift or a siege. In this instance, however, he wouldn't complain. Instead, he'd simply wait for the signal for him to make his move. For Brandon Stark, infiltrating the Dun Fort had been a simple process, though one that had required a good bit of agility. Over the last few days they'd scouted the place well and had come across a few access points, provided one had the ability to reach them. The Dun Fort sat on a cliff face, most likely so that they could not be flanked and force a head-on attack. For most people that one avenue would be all they considered. Jiraiya, however, had trained them in something called parkour, which gave them not only a freedom of movement but opened the eyes of a practitioner to their environment, allowing them to see things they may otherwise have overlooked. It was with the usage of this ability that Elbert and Barbie had scaled the back of the fort's wall in order to infiltrate the place. He, however, had decided on a different path, a passageway that his father had told him of. The Darklands, he knew, was an old house of first men and the petty kings of the area, though not the original settlers or kings of the area. House Duscan had been the true kings for thousands of years before they fell during the Andal invasion. House Darkland was a branch house began when one king's sister had married a childhood friend. When the main house of Duskan was wiped out, the Darklands had taken over. As they were not the original owners of the place, the Dun Fort had secrets the Darklands had no clue about. One of these secrets were the catacombs that ran beneath the city. According to the plans his father presented him with, Bran the Builder had designed them so that the Duskans had a means of escape in the case of a siege. He had been impressed when first presented with the scroll containing the plans, as it was clearly ancient, and it was clear only magic was maintaining its form. Still, he had studied it intensely for nearly a month prior to the arrival of Varys. No one had forgotten that it had been the events of Duskendale that began the downward spiral that was ended by the rebellion, and as such they had known this would be the first obstacle that would have to be overcome. He found the entrance easy enough. Exactly where it was said to be in the waters behind the fort was a small piece of stone marked with the crest of the builder. Pushing it in resulted in latches coming loose before a small doorway opened just large enough for a small dinghy to slip through. It must have been on a timer, as only just about 2 minutes after he made his way inside, the doorway was closing and sealing itself as if it had never been there. Thankfully, he'd already gotten out of the water and lit a torch that had been placed in a sconce on the wall. He'd navigated the catacombs for nearly 5 minutes by his count, lighting torches along the way before he'd come across a fork in the path. According to the original plans, this split shouldn't be there, as the passage was supposed to go left and would eventually lead to an exit in one of the towers. It was out of curiosity more than anything he took the path to the right, following the path through several twists and turns and stumbling across a few dead ends before he appeared in what appeared to be a crypt. This was odd because the Duskans had never buried their dead, they'd always sent them out to sea and burned them. He continued to follow the path, though at times he had to abandon traditional routes due to damage of decay, such as stairs that had rotted away. In these cases he'd either leapt the distance or found a way around. Eventually he came to a stop outside of a room sealed by an iron gate and surrounded by more stone on both sides, which led to dead ends. Inside the room were quite a few chests, but the centerpiece was a coffin which from his eye looked to have been made of marble. Unfortunately, there was no obvious way of accessing the inside, such as a lock that could be picked, which meant there was most likely another pressure lock. Placing the torch down into a sconce behind him, he held both his arms out to either side, palms splayed outward for a few moments before a pair of massive air blasts erupted from his palms. His application of force was soft, as he didn't want to destroy the place and instead used only enough force so that a pressure stone could move. From his position the wind raced across the room, pushing into the walls and across the floor. After only a few seconds, less than half a minute, he felt a pair of stones sink in, one in the ground and one on the end wall on the right side of the room. Stopping the airflow quickly, he smirked as he watched the gate sink into the ground while he used a short burst of power to will the dust that floated in the air to fall instantly. The air blast was amongst the first things he'd learned when it came to his combat magic. Though simple in nature, the air blast was quite versatile and with an effectiveness that varied with the amount of power applied. He'd once used the attack while out to sea in order to escape the pull of a whirlpool. It had been the first time he'd displayed his ability openly, and he knew members of that crew had been trying to learn magic ever since whenever they made port at home. Making his way into the once sealed room, Brandon stopped at one of the chests, of which there were 5, all of which were made of iron. The chests was locked, but thankfully the key was already inside. However, instead of immediately turning it, he funneled a small bit of wind inside of the lock for a few moments before pulling it back, along with a bit of dust, its coloration showing it was mostly rust. Turning the key, he was pleased when the chest rather easily unlocked, and upon opening the chest was shocked to discover it was full of gemstones, specifically rubies. He repeated the process a few times and found the other chests contained diamonds, sapphires, emeralds, and even gold coins. Knowing the chests would be heavy, he immediately made plans to come back for it all. He'd need to sneak in some people to help with it though. Moving over to the coffin, he braced himself, as with what was in the chests he was sure what was in the coffin must be even more valuable. Pushing the lid back, he found he was not to be disappointed, as there were no bones inside or anything that hinted there may have once been a body laid to rest inside. Instead, what he found was a set of armor. The armor consisted of greaves, chestguard, vambraces and spalders, all of it having a scale pattern and possessing the signature ripple patterns of Valyrian steel. Also resting in the coffin was a sheathed sword that he recognized instantly as a claymore. Pulling it slightly from its sheath, he was once more greeted with the rippled pattern of Valyrian steel and realized that he was holding Doombringer, the sword of House Duskan. He had to fight the urge to immediately put on the armor and sword. He couldn't risk wearing such a thing in front of Aerys, as he'd have no choice but to hand it all over, and as much as he liked and respected Esser Barristan, he would no doubt speak of him having it. With his new discoveries, he scratched the idea of bringing anyone back here with him. Instead, he reached into his pouch and retrieved a scroll, one Jiraiya had given him almost 2 years ago. At the time he'd used it to sneak in gifts for his family that he'd gotten during his travels. Jiraiya had never asked for it back, so he'd kept it but made sure to use it sparingly so people wouldn't notice it. Placing the armor and the sword into a pile on top of the unrolled scroll, he channeled his magic into the scroll, causing the items to vanish in a plume of smoke, with the characters for armor and sword appearing on the scroll in runic. Following this, he moved over to the chests and repeated the process with each one before rolling up the scroll and slipping it back into his pouch. Leaving the room, he tapped the stone that was still sunk into the floor, causing it to pop back into place before the gate came back up to seal itself into place. Retrieving his torch, he relit it before moving to the right of the room. He saw a small part of the wall had been pushed in and gave it a bit more of a push, causing the doorway to open. Slipping through it, he pushed the door closed behind him, leaving the room almost as if he'd never been there. When the signal came, it caught the attention of many people, and though he'd never heard the sound before, Esser Barristan knew it was what he'd been waiting for. While others ran to investigate the sound, he'd remained at his post. Brandon Stark landed in front of him within 30 seconds, withdrawing a key he used to open the dungeon gate behind him. They were through the gate in seconds, and then Brandon was sprinting ahead. Thankfully, very few people were being permitted inside the dungeons right now, so there were no guards they had to deal with. They found the king within 2 minutes and found he was sitting up against the back wall. He was a pathetic sight, covered in bruises, and the garb he was wearing had clearly seen better days, covered in blood as it was. He tensed at their approach, and the Kingsguard was quick to remove the helm to reveal his face. "Your Grace, it is Barristan Selmy. My companion is Brandon Stark, Lord Rickard Stark's son. The Queen tasked us to retrieve you," said the knight as he made his way to the man. "Put him on your back. I'd say we've got about a minute before people make their way back this way," said Brandon. It took some convincing, but he soon had the king secured on his back and they were making their way quickly out. They'd only got halfway out before they came across a pair of guards racing towards them. Brandon didn't slow. Instead, he picked up speed before slamming his hands into the throats of both guards, simultaneously slamming them both down to the ground on their backs before he rose up, a pair of blades visible extended beneath his arms that soon slid backwards and disappeared. "Let's go," barked Brandon before taking off once more, with Esser Barristan quick to follow after him. Thankfully, they didn't encounter anyone else before they made it out of the dungeons, making a dash towards the main gate, which was unguarded. Slipping out, they were greeted to the sight of John Umber sitting outside of the gates, sitting on a wagon with 2 horses attached to it. "Get him up there. Our friends have already gone ahead to make sure the way is cleared for us," said John. "Good. The last thing we need is one of them to get a lucky shot with an arrow," said Brandon as he helped Esser Barristan get the king into the back of the wagon. They had barely gotten him settled before the sound of running reached them. Turning towards the sound, Esser Barristan felt his own rage flare at the quick approach of Simon Holland, Duskendale's master of arms, and more importantly the man who had murdered his oath-sworn brother Esser Gwaingaunt when they first took the king hostage. Unsheathing his own sword, he blocked the incoming attack before pushing it off and lashing out with a strike that cut clean across Holland's torso despite the leather armor, before reversing the direction, giving him another cut and swinging once more, causing his head to fly. Once done, he sheathed his sword and hopped in the back with his king while Brandon hopped up front. Despite the wagon not being made for it, they tore down the cobblestone streets. Despite the moon being in its place in the sky, it wasn't truly that late and there were still a few people out in the streets. Those people had no choice but to suddenly stop or dodge out of the way, as John Umber had no intention of slowing down. As they neared the main gates of the city, they could see them already beginning to open, and only near the gates did they slow before they stopped altogether at the gates. "You remember the rest of the plan?" questioned Brandon as he hopped off of the wagon. "No names. Only the king, queen and Prince Rhaegar can know the identities of the full team," said Esser Barristan quickly. "Where are you going?" demanded the king. "The queen tasked us to get you out and disappear. She wants to keep us as much of a secret as she can for the time being. Tywin's camp is not far from here. If we go any further we risk rousing his suspicion," said Brandon. "I will see you all rewarded for this," said Aerys as Brandon stood before him while Esser Barristan moved to take control of the wagon. "Perhaps one day. For now you should focus on recovery," said Barbie, surprising the king with the knowledge one of his rescuers was a woman. "The camp should be about 5 minutes away. The only reason we haven't been seen is due to the dark. Go." With that, the 4 ran off, disappearing into the darkness. Cracking the reins of the wagon, Esser Barristan urged the horses on, and true to Brandon's word, they arrived at Tywin's camp within 5 minutes. Within that time, Aerys somehow managed to pull himself together, though he did so by focusing on one thing, and that was rage and the desire for vengeance. By the time Tywin and his commanders had appeared, the fire had been well and truly stoked and the dragon was awake for all to see. When he spoke, the temperature surrounding him seemed to rise and his eyes seemed to glow with an eerie light. In the aftermath of what would go on to become known as the Defiance of Duskendale, it would be Aerys's revenge that would become both legendary and terrible. Though Lord Darklan would surrender upon the discovery that he no longer had a hostage, Aerys would not be swayed from his vengeance and demanded the deaths of Dennis and his entire family, including uncles, aunts, and distant House Darklan kinsmen living in Duskendale. House Holland, who were not only related by marriage to the Darklans but helped in his imprisonment, also felt his wrath and were also put to death. Special care was given to a young squire by the name of Robin Hollard, a boy who pulled his beard when he first was seized, was killed on the rack. Most other deaths were quick as they were put to the sword. Lord Darklan found himself castrated and was forced to watch as his wife had her tongue and lady parts torn out. When this was all done, Aerys had ordered the lot of them burned. Lords Darklan and Hollard along with their wives were burned alive, and in the end there had been only a single survivor, young Dantos Hollard, and only as a boon to Esser Barristan, who had requested it. Though not many knew of it at the time, but the monster that would become known as the Mad King was born that night, and his laughs as the fires burned would haunt the nightmares of witnesses for years to come. They reached White Harbor in the early morning light, and while his friends immediately made their departures, Barbie and John for their homes and Elbert to check on an order with a blacksmith, Brandon found himself traveling the halls of Frostmourne. He was immediately led to see his Aunt Branda, who was the head of the bank. The years had been kind to her, as despite being his mother's elder sister, she still looked as if she were in her 20s. She had married Aaron Flint, the second son of the Lord of Widow's Watch, and had two boys, Roderick and Errol, who were 8 and 5 respectively. The bank had been under her direction since the very beginning, and in that time had grown to become a huge beast that rivaled the Iron Bank, and there was even talk of opening a branch in King's Landing. "How was your trip, nephew?" questioned Branda after she released him from her greeting hug. "Surprisingly profitable," said Brandon. With that he launched into his story about the catacombs beneath the Dun Fort. He would admit that he got a bit of a thrill from the look in her eyes when he released his newly found wealth from the seal. In this life she'd been his first crush, and while he'd gotten over it, there was still that bit of himself that delighted in impressing her. She also helped him to try on the armor, and while it was ill-fitting at the moment, she was sure that he would grow into it, and if not, she could have it refitted for him. "As for the jewels and coins, I'll have to speak to your father about it. I've no doubt that some of it will go to the family account, but you'll still see your fair share of it," said Branda. "I figured that would be the case. I have a couple of plans I need to speak with him about as well." The armor was soon returned to the scroll, though he took the opportunity to place the sword on his back. He planned to be well used to it before things picked up for his house again. A few minutes later, and a group of men entered the room, each of them taking up one end of each chest and moving to take them to the Stark Vault. He took his leave not long later and headed to the Wolf Den, where he was debriefed by Jiraiya. The man had congratulated him on his find and stated they'd begin training him to wield heavy-class weapons so that he would be comfortable with the claymore when that time came. The return to King's Landing had been a quick one. Rather than travel by land, the king had commandeered a ship from the blockade to return him to his seat. It took only a few days by sea to make their return, and upon arrival they'd been met by 3 more members of the Kingsguard. The king was loaded into a carriage, and while one took the reins, the other 3 rode horseback surrounding it. Upon return to the Red Keep, the king was immediately taken to see the new Grand Maester Cleric. Lady Sakura had unfortunately still not returned from the north, where she'd gone to visit her former teacher months ago, which left them with no choice but to use the Maester. Pycelle, the previous Grand Maester, had been sentenced to the Night's Watch a few months after the birth of Viserys. He would replace the Maester at Castle Black, who had been released of his vows and sent to Winterfell. Lord Stark had accepted this, as he'd known Maester Aemon since he was but a boy himself. It had been a great move from the Queen and had averted what could have been a very bloody affair between the North and the Citadel. It had left the Night's Watch with a Maester problem for a few years, which they solved by having temporary holders in place on a rotation until Pycelle had been sent there. After the Maester had seen to his health, the king had dismissed everyone with the exception of the Queen, with the Kingsguard leaving. Esser Oswell went to guard the door while the rest retreated to the White Sword Tower to debrief Esser Barristan. Nearly 2 hours later the Queen emerged and addressed the court. When she did, she had a few announcements, such as announcing the extinction of House Darklan and that House Hollard had been reduced to a single member. Despite this, both houses were stripped of all lands and titles, and House Riker was given the lands and incomes for Duskensdale. Furthermore, the Northern Mercenary Company, known as the Fangs of Fenrir, would be given titles equivalent to knights in all of the 7 kingdoms. As they did not follow the 7 but northern gods and customs, the rules would be slightly different. As they accepted women amongst their ranks, these women would hold the new title of Dame. Furthermore, as Lord Stark had not hesitated to send aid in the most elite squad he had access to, the North was being elevated to a principality, and henceforth Lord Stark and his descendants would take the title of Prince or Princess of the North, or alternatively the Prince or Princess of Winter. With her announcements made, the Queen retreated from the room, and later that day the ravens were sent out with these announcements. The hornet's nest had definitely been shaken up, and the board would see a massive restructuring. Of course, none of these people, with the exception of the Queen, had any clue about the storm that would soon be coming their way. The arrival of Jiraiya and Tsunade had only ensured further changes. The things that his family had been taught had made them not only stronger, but smarter, and brought them all closer still. The North as a whole was better than it had ever been, even during the times of the Winter Kings. As such, when he'd gone off to the Vale this time, he'd been far more prepared than he had the first time around. With all of his training and lessons, not to mention previous life experience, had come confidence. As such, it was not the shy wolf they'd met, but the quiet wolf. Also, unlike the last time, he wasn't there to be raised, and as such would only spend a few short years there before returning to the North. That meant that instead of being an 8-year-old boy, he'd been 13, not yet a man, but well trained and more capable than many of his peers, be they of the North or otherwise. Of course, this time he'd also spent the majority of his time in the Vale as a prince, granting him a higher station than Robert. It hadn't started that way, of course, but in the years since that announcement he'd gotten used to it. The bond between himself and Robert had been quick to form despite the lack of time together and their older ages. Though Robert had already spent a few years in the Vale establishing himself, when Ned had arrived he'd had an immediate impact. Despite being younger, his training had given him a level of strength, speed and agility that had defied his age and size, which had quickly helped establish him as amongst the best warriors in the Vale. Another difference was that he hadn't spent the entire time in the Vale, but had left quite a few times to return home. He'd even been part of a group in a short trip to Essos to get some fight experience. More importantly for him, he'd been able to be a bigger part of his siblings' lives as they all grew up. There was a feeling of pride that he felt for his siblings now that he hadn't felt in his first run through, and he was pleased to admit, if only to himself, that he knew them much better than he had before. He had encouraged Robert to reach out to his own siblings, but things hadn't worked out as well for them, and Robert had returned to the Vale in disappointment. Unfortunately, Robert's parents had still ended up drowning in Shipbreaker's Bay, and he'd once again returned to the Vale, blaming the Targaryens. 2 years after that, he had traveled to King's Landing for the first time in this life for the wedding of Prince Rhaegar and Princess Elia Martell. Returning to King's Landing had not been something he'd ever planned on doing, though it had been a much more pleasant experience than he'd assumed it would be. It was during this time that he learned that the betrothal between himself and Catelyn had been made official. Apparently, Catelyn had heard enough of Brandon's exploits that she'd written her father and asked specifically for the marriage to be with him instead. Of course, this version of Catelyn was a far cry from the one he'd previously known. This one wasn't so obsessed about living as a southern lady, and though it had taken time, had been accepted amongst the northern women and was as much of a warrior as they were. He'd also gotten to see Lyanna interact with Rhaegar and Elia throughout their stay. Though younger, he'd seen how they both interacted with the then 14-year-old girl. Of course, for the event itself, Lyanna had given them their space. There had been much grumbling, with many knowing already that Rhaegar would have 2 wives, but none had bothered them on that day. Following the wedding, he'd returned to the Vale, though he had left again later that year and traveled to Dragonstone for the birth of Princess Rhaenys. Predictably, Robert wasn't happy with the news that Lyanna would marry Rhaegar and stated he would be a better choice. He'd informed his friend that he was mistaken and with his ways, and how Northerners viewed marriage, that he'd have to kill him the first time he fathered another bastard, if Lyanna didn't beat him to it. That conversation had ended any further discussion of Robert marrying Lyanna. It was, however, the beginning of Robert thinking of their children marrying in the future. His time in the Vale, however, was now at an end, and though shorter than his first time through, Eddard felt it had gone much better this time around. He had left the Arai with a small team of guards, all of whom were wolves. From the Eyrie they'd rowed to Gulltown and boarded a ship that would take them to White Harbor. It was a move they made so that they would not need to deal with the Frys to cross the Twins, and as such a route they took whenever he needed to travel home or to the Vale. The ship they boarded this time, however, was the Javelin, which had given him an early reunion with its captain, his brother Brandon. It had taken only a few days to cut through the waters and reach White Harbor, but still more than enough time for the brothers to catch up and for Eddard to get his sea legs back under him. They arrived at White Harbor late in the afternoon and were hosted by Lord Manderley, who threw a feast in honor of Eddard's return to the north. By this point the feast was simply part of his routine, and Eddard had realized the man would make any excuse to hold a feast. The next morning they were back on the road heading to Winterfell by horse, which took another few days. As they crested a hill, Eddard took a moment to take in the sight of his home with fond eyes. "'Tis a sight, isn't it?" said Brandon. "That it is," said Eddard. "And one day it will be yours," said Brandon, causing Eddard to shake his head in fond amusement. Brandon had become a campaign a few years back, making it plain that he didn't want to be the next Prince of Winterfell. Eddard had of course been telling him for the same amount of time whenever the subject was broached with him that he would be a good at the job. Apparently he mentioned it even more often if the laughter of their companions was anything to go by. "One day you'll accept the fact that you were born and raised to rule this place," said Eddard. "Perhaps, but it's not something I'd be happy doing. I enjoy my freedom, and the ability to just prep my ship and go is something I don't see myself giving up," said Brandon. "Careful, brother, or people may start calling you the Sea Wolf. It's not just the call of the sea. I enjoy discovering new lands, meeting new people and seeing new cultures," explained Brandon. "I'm sure that's not all of it," said Ned. "Well, if you must know, I also like discovering new pussy, but father wouldn't be as accepting of that one," said Brandon, causing Ned to laugh. "So Prince Brandon the Wanderer, huh?" said Ned after regained his breath. "That one I like. Now let's get you home, little brother." Within 30 minutes the duo were entering into the gates of Winterfell. After copious greetings and exchanges, the two brothers were able to leave their horses and continue into the keep. They found their parents not long later within their father's solar. The greetings were warm, and if Eddard enjoyed the warmth of his mother's embrace before she released him, no one would speak ill of it. Breaking the embrace, Ned took a moment to look over the place and found that it hadn't changed much since his last visit, or even his youth. There was one rather new addition, and that was an axe that hung behind his seat on the wall. The axe had been a gift to Rickard from himself, Brandon, Lyanna and Benjen a few years ago. Jiraiya had gotten it forged from the best blacksmith he knew as a favor to them. It had a handle made of ash wood that was a little over 3 feet in length with a double-bladed axe head. The front blade was bigger, about 7 inches lengthwise, while the back blade was about 3.5 inches. The head of the axe was made of ethium and inscribed with runes that made it even more dangerous and had ornate gold decorating it. The runes allowed a number of effects. For starters, he could channel his magic through the axe to produce elemental attacks of either wind or ice nature. Another rune linked the axe to him so that he could summon it to his hand at any time, no matter the distance. The final rune allowed it to repair itself if it were ever to break. According to Jiraiya, the weapon was incredibly powerful, and if used correctly and wisely would have true rivals even amongst the god-tier weapons. As such, like Ice and Frostmourne before it was lost, the axe would become a family weapon, one wielded by the head of House Stark, and as such was named Frostwind. "So Eddard, how was your trip?" questioned his mother, breaking him from his thoughts. "Relaxing for the most part. We had one encounter with a small group of bandits, but that was easily handled," said Ned. "Good. The more time you can relax while traveling the better," said Liara. "Now Brandon, did you retrieve the package?" questioned Rickard. "Of course," said Brandon, reaching into a pouch and removing a scroll which he handed to his father, who accepted it and placed it inside his desk. "Now that you are both home, there is a matter that we wish to discuss with you," said Rickard, getting his sons to perk up. "Your brother's 14th year is upon us. It is time we begin searching for a wife for him," stated Liara. The twins, Darren and Shayna, were prodigies. Though just shy of their 14th year, the two were greater warriors than knights twice their age. They had begun their training at just 4 years old under the direction of their older brother Rhaegar and Uchiha Sasuke. At 8 they had been sent to Dragonstone for more advanced training under them, along with Sir Arthur Dane, who had taken Darren on as a squire. Almost immediately they started learning both firebending and runic magic, which they seemed to catch on to quickly. At 11 is when things began changing for them as their interests and abilities took different paths. Shayna, for instance, began an apprenticeship under Sakura to learn healing, while Darren had begun learning warcraft and lightning magic under Sasuke. At the moment the two were sitting in their brother's solar, fidgeting nervously as he looked at them. They'd been caught kissing in Darren's room by Sakura, who had brought them here. "So how long has this been going on?" questioned Rhaegar, his face expressionless. "Not long, maybe a moon," said Darren, looking down to his feet. I wanted to get used to it," said Shayna quietly. "What do you mean?" questioned Rhaegar, frowning. "I started having dreams when I went back to King's Landing. I thought they were regular dreams, so I just ignored them. Then one night things got weird, the place froze and this older version of me turned and stared right at me," said Shayna. "So a dragon dream, you glimpsed possible versions of your future," said Rhaegar, sighing, getting a nod from her. "When I was a boy, much younger than you two are now, I started having dragon dreams," said Rhaegar, surprising both kids, causing them to look up. "According to Mother, I described my wives in detail when I was around 6, explained Rhaegar. So we're not in trouble? Questioned Darren. Oh, you are, simply because you said nothing. What if we'd already settled on a husband for Shayna, or a wife for you? As it is, we put it off because you are twins and Valyrian twins seem to be drawn to each other. Furthermore, it seems neither of you have taken into consideration your reputations if you were caught. As it is, you are lucky it was Lady Sakura who walked in on you. At this both of them paled and he had to force himself to hold back a grin. He wrote a quick note and dismissed them, telling them to give it to Sasuke as it was near time for their daily spar anyway. Once the door closed behind them and he'd given them some time to move on, Rhaegar slumped back in his chair while Sakura took the vacated seat. You knew something, said Sakura. I saw 3 possible husbands for Shayna. Darren was the one I'd have chosen, but I didn't delve too deep into those futures, explained Rhaegar. Good, those two were meant to be together, they bonded in the womb, said Sakura, her eyes glowing a radiant green. Sometimes I forget you're a goddess, then you do things like that, said Rhaegar. I try not to advertise it. Your world isn't strong enough to handle even my power anymore. In a few hundred years maybe, but we've got to get the magic back to an acceptable level, said Sakura. So how do the twins factor? Questioned Rhaegar. After they marry you'll send them to Volantis. In time they will take over its rule, enabling a seamless merger when it's time, said Sakura. You're playing that far ahead? Questioned Rhaegar, frowning. Indeed, and even further. That's why you were gifted with the sight, so you could make the correct moves when you cannot consult one of us, said Sakura. At this, Rhaegar looked at her in surprise for but a few long moments before his expression suddenly changed in a way that reminded Sakura absently of her old teammate Naruto. Benjen Stark was a happy boy. He'd never really considered himself a happy person in his past life, but he supposed that had been the result of his altered family life. He hadn't realized how much he'd needed the love of a mother and the presence and reassurance of a father in his first life. Now that he had those things, he knew how much his first life was lacking. As such, he'd latched onto this new life and thrown himself into it with all the fervor he could muster. With all the other children around while he was growing up, he just let himself be a kid and let loose, and even when his memories came in at 10, he saw no reason to act differently. After all, he was happy. His family was closer than it had ever been. He and Lyanna didn't have to hide who they were, and he even had more family living in White Harbor. Despite being a third son, he was given a lord's education when it came to his studies. Not only that, but he'd been taught to wield many types of weapons, and he was still learning some. Like his brothers before them, he and Lyanna were taken as personal students under Jiraiya, and he had even learned some things under Tsunade. While not a proper apprentice to the woman, he'd learned enough to treat injuries in the field for emergencies. Unlike before, when training had felt like a duty, now it was fun, especially when they had mock battles. He'd also done a bit of traveling, and while he hadn't been to as many places as Brandon had been, he'd still been to Essos and another land called Ypria, which had taken nearly 2 moons to reach by ship. Brandon had wanted to take him to the Summer Islands, but Lyanna had pulled her axe on him, so he couldn't go. Still, that was more places, foreign countries, than Eddard had been to since he spent so much time in the Vale. Today, however, he was at his happiest. Eddard had come home a moon previous, surprising him and Lyanna by coming earlier than expected. As if that wasn't enough, today was his birthday, and while all their birthdays were celebrated, his had extra meaning to the family as they celebrated his mother surviving this time. He'd been smiling most of the day. Even with his training and lessons, the only time the smile left his face is when he'd needed to really concentrate. While he was still closest to Lyanna, he also had a larger circle of friends, including a pair of cousins who were just a few years younger. At this point he was enjoying himself with his friends. His birthday feast was already in full swing, and he was surrounded by people, all of whom was having fun. The only surprise had been the number of lords that had arrived today, as he knew he wasn't important enough for that. He'd been surprised to see Lyanna wearing a dress of all things, but she'd simply hugged him to her and said it was her favorite brother's birthday. She was at his side like she always was on this day, but they were also surrounded by their host of friends. He'd gotten kisses from all of her female friends, though only on the cheek. It had still left him blushing under all of the attention. Suddenly the attention of the hall was called to the front where his parents were standing. Thank you all for coming today. 14 years ago today our youngest son was born. Thank all of you for celebrating with us, said his father, raising his goblet to the room, getting a cheer from many. Of course, despite our pride, that isn't all that happened all those years ago. A few days later a gathering of lords and ladies was called, and on that day plans were made and set in motion. It is now our pride to say that we have the biggest army and the most skilled warriors in these 7 kingdoms as well as Essos. While we have always known this, we are pleased to say the rest of them now know this as well, said his mother, getting another cheer from the room. We pushed our pride to the side for the betterment of the whole of the North. We excavated caves and now have active mines of gold, silver, iron and even diamonds. We have rebuilt our navy and it now exceeds anything in our history. We now have the best smith shops on this side of the world with some of the best blacksmiths and armorers in the world coming here to work and teaching our people, and through this program we now boast several journeyman smiths born here in the north. We now have a number of seamstresses and jewelers that have created works that are some of our most sought-after exports. We have breweries now making not just ale, but wines and harder liquors, all of which are highly sought-after exports. I am pleased to announce that we have the lowest number of poor citizens on this side of the world, and we have surpassed the Westerlands as the richest of the 7 kingdoms," said his father, producing a huge cheer from the room. As if that wasn't enough, we agreed to put away our ire, rage and even greater pride and speak with those who live beyond the wall. In doing so, we have established an alliance with several of their tribes that have grown in strength over time. Doing this brought us more wealth, but more importantly we discovered members of our families many of us thought dead. Furthermore, there hasn't been a kidnapping in 13 years, and skirmishes between us and those beyond the wall are at the lowest rate they have been in centuries. My lords and ladies, we wanted to restore our reputation amongst the 7 kingdoms, and we are pleased to say we have more than succeeded. You put your faith in us and our insane plan, and today my husband and I thank you all and raise our goblets to you. Skål! Came the cry of the entire hall as everyone took to their drinks. Now we must turn our attention to the future, however before that we have a gift for our son, said Lord Rickard, calling Benjen forward. Getting out of his seat, he wasn't surprised and was in fact thankful that Lyanna accompanied him to the front of the room. As they approached, Benjen had an idea of what was coming next, as at this point it was basically a tradition for them. Because of this, he was not all that surprised that as he reached the front, Brandon and Eddard approached carrying a long wooden case between them, which they placed on the table. Following after his brothers was Tobho Mott, a Cohoric master blacksmith that had settled in White Harbor when Benjen was around 6. At this point, you all know that we have made it something of a tradition to present a weapon to our children on their 14th birthday. As such, today is Benjen's turn, said Rickard. Approaching the case, he eyed his father for but a moment before opening it. Inside he found a sword that was honestly breathtaking to look at. It was a single-edged sword, straight though the edge side had a dip in it. The guard was curved and the hilt looked as if it was made from a tooth. The pommel was curved, which made sense as it served to cap the tooth, which itself was curved. I call it Orcrist, 39 inches overall, with a 30-inch blade made entirely of ethium. The hilt is made from a dragon tooth. May it serve you well, young lord, said the man. Thank you, Master Mott. Knowing of what you've made for my family previously, I'm quite sure it will surpass all expectations, said Benjen, getting the man to bow his head before he turned away and walked off. Knowing what to do next, Benjen turned and hoisted up the weapon for the entire hall to see. This resulted in a round of applause, but he knew it would follow with him making the rounds of the room so that others can examine the sword up close. Reaching inside the case once more, he withdrew the scabbard, which was 30 inches, made with a metal and wood grain patterned finish, decorated with vine and leaf motifs, with a built-in belt loop and a fur-lined interior. Sliding the blade into the scabbard, he found it fit perfectly as expected. Also included was a brown sword belt which seemed to be extra long, made entirely of leather that with sturdy buckle, and 2 leather straps that attached to the scabbard. No stranger to sword belts, he soon had it secured around his waist, and his new sword fitted so that it hung on his left side at a diagonal angle, so it didn't touch the ground. Now, before we return to our festivities, a few announcements. As you all know, we have agreed to a betrothal for Lyanna and Prince Rhaegar. The wedding will take place here in Winterfell's Godswood next year. This is a fulfillment of the Pace of Ice and Fire signed by Cregan Stark, said Rickard. Of course, by this point this was considered common knowledge in the north, and though many were jealous, many more were also appreciative that the ancient pact was finally being honored by the Targaryens. Not many knew the particulars, but all knew that the betrothal for Prince Rhaegar had involved Queen Rhaella, Princess Liara and Princess Kiera Martell of Dorne. Outside of the 3 houses, not many of the betrophal's details were known, only that the terms were agreed upon by all 3 with no input from their spouses. What was known was that it was to be a true 3-way marriage, in the sense that Princess Lyanna would be just as much a wife to Princess Elia as she would be to Rhaegar, and vice versa. Apparently it was an old Valyrian custom and had been something Prince Rhaegar had discovered in his exploration of Dragonstone. As for Brandon, there is no news of a betrothal as of yet. Queen Rhaella asked that we wait, as she has someone in mind that politically would help us well in the future, said Liara, causing a few to grumble. Despite being something of a notorious womanizer, Brandon Stark was a dream catch for many of the women. Not only was he the heir to Winterfell, but even Lyanna had heard of his prowess as a lover more times than she cared to admit. As the only girl among the Stark children, Lyanna knew the girls lusted after her brothers as much as the boys lusted after her. Of the Stark children, Lyanna was also the only one that was still a virgin. The laws around premarital sex had been relaxed significantly. In fact, as long as unmarried people weren't blatant and no children were sired, it was pretty much okay to do as you liked, provided of course the encounter was consensual. Lyanna, however, was marrying Prince Rhaegar, and even with her sexual education lessons she couldn't put what she learned in practice. Last time it wasn't as bad, but this time, now that everyone around her was pretty much sexually active, it led to a buildup of frustration. Luckily they'd found a loophole and she could explore other girls as much as she liked as long as she was discreet about it and her maidenhead remained intact. Her thoughts on this matter, however, were pushed aside as Lord Jiraiya and Lady Tsunade stepped forward to speak. A little over 14 years ago now, Tsunade and I came here for the first time. We were traveling the world on something of a second honeymoon and just fell in love with the place. However, our time here was never meant to be permanent, and as such we are preparing for our travel back home. At this news a deafening silence overtook the hall. Despite their age, none had ever expected the two of them to leave. Even Lyanna, knowing the two were gods, felt surprised at the news. The two had become the grandparents that she and her siblings had needed, so to hear them speak of leaving them actually hurt. When we first arrived, and Prince Rickard and Princess Lyanna asked for our aid, we accepted on the basis that you were all in desperate need of help. You were already a hardy people, but so much of your potential had been wasted in no small part thanks to those fools in the Citadel. I speak for both of us when I say that you all have been an absolute joy to teach, and we are sure that you can now maintain our teachings and push them forwards," said Tsunade. "With that said, we are not leaving immediately as there are still things to be done. For instance, I have asked Prince Brandon to take over as leader of the wolves and he has accepted. I'll spend the next few years teaching him the ropes for that before he transitions fully to the leader," said Jiraiya. At this there was thunderous applause, both that they wouldn't just up and leave them and that Brandon, who everyone knew was Jiraiya's apprentice, would be taking up the mantle of mentor to the wolves. Even Lyanna, who knew her own time as a wolf was coming to an end, couldn't help but feel pride for her brother and hope for their future. As for me, well, there are a couple things. I have some people to finish training, but more importantly for me, a couple of my grandchildren are preparing to wed. I'll not leave until I have both attended the weddings and delivered their first children. At this Lyanna found she couldn't help herself and, blushing despite her usual methods, gave her hug that was returned just as tightly. It was only now that she realized that she was almost at an equal height of the older woman, who was as much of a fixture of her life as old Nan was. She was also incredibly pleased that she saw them just as they saw her. As she moved to step back, Tsunade held on and instead moved them to a side embrace, allowing them to step away from the front together. She could see her mother was smiling widely, which made her look radiant as her father stepped forward again. Brandon and I spoke at length over the last 2 moons about this, and his resolve never wavered. He feels that this is his calling, as it will allow him to still protect our people yet also travel and see other lands. This decision, however, creates a vacancy, as with his new duties he cannot take up the headship of our family, nor can he take rule of Winterfell and the north. With that in mind, I am also proud to announce that Eddard will henceforth be known as the heir of House Stark and of Winterfell. As such, he will one day succeed me as the Prince of the North. There was a massive applause for Eddard at this. Normally it wouldn't be so, but it was clear that not only had Brandon not been skipped over, but everyone knew that this was something he desired. The North's worst-kept secret was now not only no longer secret but acknowledged. Of course, many could remember that Eddard was one of the first-generation wolves, and while he hadn't been on as many trips, he'd been doing equally important work in the Vale, ensuring their alliance and making sure that their wares could pass through the land safely and be sold. Ned, however, was still himself, and rather than bask in the praise he blushed visibly, which only made people cheer him more. Lyanna, embracing her feminine side, yet again gave both her brothers hugs and kisses on the cheek. As you all know, Catelyn Tully has been a ward here for the last few years as part of her betrothal agreement and our alliance with the Riverlands. Next year Eddard and Catelyn will wed once more here in Winterfell, about 3 moons before Lyanna," said Liara, causing the cheers to erupt again. Lyanna smiled over at her friend, who was blushing hotly and surrounded by other girls that were now giggling to themselves. Catelyn had come a long way since her arrival, and Lyanna had quite honestly been the hardest on her. Of course, she had always saved her ire for the girl until they clashed on the training field, but eventually as the girl began to change, her ire had begun to lessen. Eventually they had become good friends, to the point that the two of them, Sonia Mormont, Aline Umber and Jade Karstark, had become thick as thieves. Of course, unlike the others, she hadn't shared her bed with Catelyn, as she knew she'd one day be wed to Eddard. That said, there was a part of her that wanted to grip the girl by the back of her hat and slam her face in her cunt, but she held that back. That thought, however, sparked something inside of her, and she began subtly looking around the room, she'd find one of the red-headed free folk girls to fuck. It had been a while since she'd made one of them a kneeler. Finally we reach the last of our announcements and come back to Benjen, said Lord Rickard after gesturing for the hall to quiet. After much discussion between my wife, Brandon, Eddard and Lyanna, we chose who we felt was a suitable wife for Benjen. This brought even more silence as everyone knew that Lyanna was incredibly protective of Benjen, who was not just the youngest but her favorite brother. The stories of what Lyanna had done to those who offended her sensibilities when it came to Benjen were no exaggeration, and many had seen her pull axe on Brandon for even mentioning taking him to the Summer Islands. At this, Lyanna stepped forward beside her father and crossed her arms. Despite the action pushing up her breasts, many saw the warrior that she was, despite the fact that she was wearing a dress, as it wouldn't surprise anyone if she had a bunch of knives on her person. After much discussion we all agreed that Benjen's wife would be of the north. As such, after much discussion between myself, the girl's head of house, and her father, we have agreed on a betrothal for Fringilla Umber. The wedding will take place in 3 years, 3 moons after her 16th birthday. This resulted in another massive cheer. They'd all known that the northern lords and ladies were beginning to feel slighted and knew a northern girl was the best option. Fringilla, she knew, was a fierce young warrior, though incredibly she had a massive crush on Benjen. Looking at the girl she saw, she was blushing massively hard, but she stiffened noticeably under her gaze. Relaxing her stance, she smiled at the girl and nodded silently, giving her approval, causing the girl to begin tearing up, but there was a big smile on her face. Benjen himself was blushing. He didn't have much experience from females and romance in his last life, something he knew Brandon had been trying to make up for over the last year. Fringilla wasn't one of the 3 girls he'd had sex with either. Those girls had all been a bit older and more to show him what to do than anything else. That said, he'd always liked the soft-spoken Umber girl. Though she wasn't an heiress, she was a good person, and never had an unkind word for anyone. Plus she was a great warrior and one of the best in their age range on top of everything else. His thoughts were broken as Jiraiya pulled him into a hug. "You're welcome, brat. She reminds me of Naruto's first wife, and if she is even half of what Hinata is, you'll be a lucky man for a very long time," whispered Jiraiya. "How do you do it?" returned Benjen, whispering just as low. "I'm a god of love, kid. I have many ways," returned Jiraiya before breaking the hold. "Remind me to teach the girl the contraceptive drought. My husband is plotting," said Tsunade quietly to Liara, who stood beside her and nodded quietly with a sigh. "As it is, I'm surprised Brandon doesn't have any bastards running around," said Liara from behind a goblet. "Contraceptive rune, drawn in blood and last for a year," said Tsunade. Unknowing of the conversation happening behind them at this time, Rickard Stark pulled his daughter into a one-armed hug and kissed her forehead before sending her off to rejoin her friends. He knew that times would get difficult in the years ahead, but for now he was content. The North and his house were flourishing, and his family was happy. At the end of it all, that's all he'd ever wanted. The end. Thanks for watching. Also remember to subscribe and like this video. See you in the next video.